Hello, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to accompany you today. I understand you use this video to drift off to sleep, so before you do, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time is it as you're watching? Now, settle in and relax. I vividly recall the first instance I heard that door burst open at 3 a.m. as if it occurred just last night. There was no gentle creak, no subtle hint, merely a thunderous crash that reverberated through the walls and jolted me from a restless slumber. Even as I pen these words, my hands tremble with the memory of that overwhelming noise, a surge of fear slicing through the silence. I reside at the very end of a narrow, secluded street, where only a handful of houses dot the path leading to mine. Most of them remain shrouded in darkness at night, their occupants either away or securely locked behind thick walls. Even when the moon is at its fullest, the streetlights barely cast enough illumination to discern silhouettes, and the rustling of wind through twisted tree branches can send shivers down the spine of even the bravest soul. It's a haunting setting on its own, but until recently, I never truly feared it. Now, it feels like a trap, and each time I hear that door fly open, I sense as if something cold and relentless is inching closer to me. That first night, I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding and my mouth instantly parched. I remember stumbling out of the sheets and groping for my glasses on the bedside table. My chest felt constricted, and each breath I took seemed alarmingly loud in the silence. My mind struggled to rationalize it as merely the wind or perhaps it was a stray animal nudging a loose latch, but the instant my bare feet touched the frigid floor, I was overcome with an unshakable certainty that there was no ordinary explanation for the sound I had just heard. I crept silently down the hallway, each floorboard beneath me groaning under my weight, the old house protesting with every step. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and I had the unnerving sensation that someone or something was breathing just behind me. When I finally reached the living room, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather seeped into my bones. The front door, which I had locked and bolted before going to bed, stood wide open. A gust of night air swept past me, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I froze in place, scanning the darkness beyond the threshold. The street lay empty, devoid of any movement except for the flickering streetlight in the distance. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In a panic, I shut the door, slid the deadbolt into place, and double-checked the lock 3 times. Then, I frantically searched for something, anything, to reinforce it. I grabbed a heavy chair and wedged it beneath the handle, but even then, my heart refused to calm. I forced myself back to bed, trying to convince myself there must be a logical explanation, but sleep eluded me. The next morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on me as I went about my routine. A neighbor passed by, and though he greeted me politely, his eyes flicked over my house with a wary look. He asked if I had heard any strange noises during the night. I reluctantly confessed, though I was careful not to divulge too much, as I didn't want him to think I was losing my grip on reality. He merely shrugged and suggested it was likely the wind sweeping off the nearby hill, the kind that occasionally rattles older houses. I forced a tense nod and assured him I would keep a watchful eye on the situation. On the second night, I fortified the door using every available resource: chains, boards nailed across the frame, and multiple locks. I remember feeling absurd as I hammered nails into the wooden planks, sweat trickling down my forehead despite the cool air. My breath caught in my throat with each strike of the hammer. I despised the desperation I felt, as though barricading myself inside my own home was somehow the only answer. My rational mind argued that I was overreacting, yet the memory of that door crashing open at 3 a.m. sent waves of dread through me that I could not ignore. By the time I finished, the door resembled the entrance to a shuttered warehouse more than that of a typical suburban house. Satisfied that I had done enough, I ate a quiet dinner and then turned on the television in an attempt to numb my anxieties. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep on the couch. The hours passed as the silence of the night enveloped everything. At some point, the house grew colder, a chill that seeped into my skin and made my muscles tighten involuntarily. Precisely at 3 a.m., the door burst open once more with a deafening crash. The impact shook the wall so violently that I nearly tumbled off the couch. My lungs constricted, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach as the boards, chains and locks, everything I had painstakingly secured was suddenly undone. The door swung open, as if nothing had ever been fastened to it. For a moment, I simply stared, every hair on my arms and neck standing erect, as an icy wave of terror enveloped me. Outside, the darkness seemed to watch back, silent and oppressively still. I saw no person, no animal, not even a faint mist, yet I sensed a presence, a strong aura that made my legs tremble. My skin grew clammy, and my breaths became shallow. The air felt wrong, as if it had thickened with malevolence. Slowly, I edged forward, fear gnawing at me from within, each step more challenging than the last. I forced myself to shut the door again, securing it as best I could, even though the effort felt futile. My hands shook uncontrollably, and a cold sweat dotted my temples. I could almost taste the fear, bitter and metallic, lingering in my mouth. Later, I sat in a daze, attempting to rationalize the irrational until dawn offered a weak sense of relief. After that second night, I decided I needed evidence of what was occurring. Perhaps if I played back a recording, I could uncover some pattern, a gust of wind, maybe, or a structural flaw in the house. Something that could make sense of this nightmare. So, on the third night, I set up a small digital voice recorder near the entrance. The battery was fresh, and I placed it on a table close to the door, leaving it running overnight. Sleep eluded me, my body tense, my mind alive with paranoia, as I imagined footsteps in the hallway. A faint rustle just beyond my field of vision made me half expect to see a figure standing in the corner whenever I turned my head. Several times, I flicked on the hallway light, only to be met with emptiness. Each flip of the switch sent my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The hours dragged on until I watched the clock inch closer to that dreaded hour. That night, the door didn't slam open at 3 a.m. as it usually did. Instead, at around 2:50, I felt a chilling draft weave through the hallway. The sudden drop in temperature was jarring, causing goosebumps to rise on my skin and my teeth to chatter. My breath turned into mist as if I stood in a winter storm, despite the mild weather outside. This time, there was no loud crash. Instead, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible click, as if a lock was being quietly disengaged, followed by a rush of cold air. My heart began to hammer wildly, and my hands grew damp with sweat. I forced myself to investigate, only to find the door slightly ajar, the chain hanging uselessly, and the board still in place but shifted as if someone had carefully bent it aside. The oppressive silence was terrifying, my pulse pounding as my vision blurred at the edges, fear threatening to consume me. In the morning, I reviewed the audio from the recorder. For the first few hours, there was a lot of static, interrupted only by the restless movements in the house. Footsteps, the rustle of blankets, the occasional creak of old floorboards. Then, at around 2:50, the audio descended into an eerie silence, as if the microphone had suddenly stopped recording. Stopped capturing ambient noise when, a moment later, I heard something that sent a jolt of terror through my entire being. It was a ragged, uneven breathing, reminiscent of someone suffering from a severe lung condition or struggling desperately to inhale. The sound grated on my nerves. Then I heard my name, whispered repeatedly in a low, rasping voice. Each repetition grew more intense, more urgent, until it culminated in a chilling, breathy laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. Listening to it made me feel lightheaded, as if I were on the verge of fainting. I played it back once more to convince myself it wasn't a figment of my imagination, but it only sounded more menacing on the second listen. The voice was undeniably real, and it was inside my house. With no other strategy in mind, I contemplated bringing someone else into the situation, perhaps a friend or an expert in paranormal phenomena. However, the thought of explaining this to another person seemed impossible. I felt certain they would label me as delusional. I also dreaded the possibility that having another witness wouldn't stop this entity and would only confirm that whatever was haunting me could attack at will, unstoppable. The day passed in a haze of anxiety, with me glancing at the door every few minutes, half convinced I would see it slowly creaking open on its own. That evening, I tried to brace myself. If this presence desired something, I needed to at least attempt to confront it. So, I removed all barricades, no boards, no extra locks, just the door, the single deadbolt, and me. My plan was to sit in the living room, lights off, and wait. I wanted to see if I could catch a fleeting glimpse of the force that had been invading my home night after night. A twisted part of me believed that witnessing it might lead to understanding, yet a lingering fear in the back of my mind questioned whether seeing it would be far worse than remaining in ignorance. The anticipation was excruciating. Every second stretched out interminably, as though the night might never conclude. I endeavored to stay composed, but my heart pounded relentlessly, and every minor sound within the house magnified in my mind. The refrigerator's hum resembled a distant growl, while the wind outside whispered through the eaves, carrying what seemed like ghostly voices. My arms were covered in goosebumps, and no matter how much water I drank, my throat remained parched. Finally, around 3 a.m., the room's temperature plummeted once more, and the overhead light flickered briefly. I caught sight of a faint shape, or perhaps a distortion, moving past the front window. My spine tensed, and I gripped the arms of the chair so tightly my knuckles ached. I tried to control my breathing, but panic was already clawing at me. The deadbolt turned with a metallic click, as if someone possessed a key on the other side. Then the door swung inward, slower than usual, revealing the silent street beyond. There was no figure standing there, no visible intruder, but the sensation of a presence, of eyes watching me, was overwhelming. I forced myself to stand, although my legs felt weak. I approached the open door, battling against every instinct that screamed at me to run. Cold sweat trickled down my back, making my skin clammy. My shirt clung uncomfortably to my body. My heart clung to me, damp with terror, as I approached the threshold. The temperature seemed to plummet even further, as though I had stepped into a walk-in freezer. My breath materialized as a ghostly mist before me. In that instant, I silently demanded that it reveal itself, speak, or do anything other than torment me with these nightly intrusions. A faint whisper grazed past my ear, my name uttered so intimately that my skin crawled. Then, I felt a brush of icy air against my cheek, causing my stomach to lurch as I staggered backward, nearly losing my balance. Something flickered at the edge of my vision, like a silhouette in the periphery, but when I whipped my head around, there was only darkness and the faint shimmer of streetlights. The door, untouched by human hands, creaked shut again, the latch clicking softly into place. After that night, I realized I wasn't merely contending with a random haunting or an intruder. This presence was methodical, almost inquisitive, arriving at the same hour as if checking on me, testing the limits of my sanity. Every day, I discovered new signs that my reality was no longer stable. Sometimes I stumbled upon puddles of near-freezing water in front of the door or strange scratch marks along the inside of the frame. On one occasion, I awoke to find that every picture frame in the living room had turned to face the wall. I felt eyes upon me constantly, as if I was never truly alone in my own home. My nerves frayed under the relentless tension, sleep became a rare commodity, and my paranoia soared to unprecedented heights. I began to see elusive forms danced in the mirrors, fleeting distortions lurking in the corners of my vision. As I lay down to rest, faint echoes of ragged breathing tormented me, leading me to question my sanity repeatedly. Perhaps I had internalized some trauma, now manifesting as these vivid hallucinations. Yet, the audio recording served as undeniable evidence that something external was indeed occurring. Those around me noticed my decline. A coworker remarked that I appeared pale and jittery. However, I never disclosed the true reason, merely attributing it to restless nights. As my mental state continued to unravel, I contemplated moving away, but the idea of leaving seemed oddly futile. A haunting suspicion gripped me that this presence would not disappear simply because I fled. It felt deeply personal, as though it was attached to me rather than to the house itself. Each attempt to rationalize the situation brought me back to the same conclusion. I had to confront this entity or, at the very least, endure it here. The final confrontation unfolded one night when I resolved that I had reached my limit. I steeled myself mentally, determined to no longer live under the shadow of this terror. At precisely 3 a.m., the door swung open as it had countless times before. However, there was no dramatic crash this time, just a slow, deliberate movement. The boards I had nailed up were gone, and the chain hung uselessly by my side. My body trembled, but I willed myself to stand at the threshold. I could feel the cold presence swirling in the darkness, like a vortex of shadows and half-formed shapes. My heart pounded so violently that my chest ached from the strain. Gathering my courage, I braced myself and demanded aloud that it leave me in peace. to halt its torment. My voice wavered and my throat was aflame, yet I reiterated my desperate request with as much determination as I could gather. The atmosphere felt oppressive, pressing against me from every direction, and my head swirled. I thought I heard that ragged breathing right next to my ear. For a split second, I feared I might faint, but a surge of adrenaline kept me upright. I sensed, rather than saw, the presence recoil like a wave retreating into the sea. In the ensuing silence, the door closed softly, and the house returned to its stillness, the air losing its chill. I remained awake until dawn, uncertain whether I had banished my tormentor or merely stunned it. In the weeks that followed, the nightly disturbances diminished. Some nights, the door remained entirely shut. On others, I would notice it shifting on its hinges, as if tested by a gentle breeze. However, I never again heard that ragged breathing or the chilling whisper that called my name. It was as if the presence had recognized my confrontation and, for the time being, retreated. Yet, I never truly felt the grip of fear really. Say me, I find myself sleeping only a few hours each night, awakening at every minor creak. Whenever 3 a.m. approaches, my skin tingles with anticipation. The door stays closed now, held fast by its lock and my unsteady resolve. But I know something lingers, a remnant of whatever crossed that threshold on those terrifying nights. I suspect it's watching, biding its time, eager to see if my courage can truly endure. I can't claim to have found a grand solution or discovered the true essence of the presence that tormented me. Yet, by standing resolute, I seem to have earned a brief respite. Occasionally, I contemplate leaving entirely, packing my belongings, and starting anew in a more vibrant, sunlit neighborhood. Still, I hesitate. A part of me fears that if I don't hold my ground, this entity might pursue me wherever I go. Another part of me wonders if, in some inexplicable way, I belong here, at the end of this desolate street, engaged in a silent standoff with something I can scarcely fathom. Every so often, I still hear faint echoes within the walls, soft murmurs and something that could be laughter. My chest tightens whenever it occurs, and I question if the next moment will bring the slamming door, the gust of frigid wind, and that voice whispering my name. As the days go by, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over, merely dormant. The sensation of being watched, of sharing my space with an unseen presence, has never truly vanished. Even now, as I glance at the door, a chill dances along my spine. I ask myself if it's merely my imagination or if something stands on the other side, waiting to see if I will falter once more. That lingering question keeps me on edge, leaving me with a persistent unease I can't quite dispel. Perhaps I drove the presence away, or perhaps it's simply allowing me a moment of peace, time enough to question my own perception and sanity. For now, I remain in this house, uncertain but stubborn, enduring the silent nights and the ever-present dread of what might occur when the clock strikes 3 a.m. once again. Though I've lingered here far longer than any reasonable person might, I am far from defeated. Whatever lurks within the shadows must be aware that I'm still here, resolutely standing guard at the end of my solitary street, ready to confront any horror that may once again pry open that door. I first spotted the red chalet during one of those twilight evenings when the sky is neither fully lit nor dark enough to hide shadows. The structure stood at the edge of a dirt road, leaning slightly as if the earth itself sought to consume it. A dense cluster of trees bordered its yard, their branches twisting overhead in a nearly palpable silence. From the very first glance, something about that chalet felt unsettling. A subtle unease in my gut warned me not to linger. Yet, I persisted in walking past it every day, convincing myself I was merely passing by, that I had nothing to fear. How naive that was. If I could turn back time, I would avoid that path entirely, but it's too late. My mind is filled with images of that crimson structure, haunting me as vividly as any nightmare. I'm just an ordinary man residing in a small town, one that offers more farmland and wooded paths than modern conveniences. I relish long walks, especially when my thoughts become tangled. There's a tranquility in the rhythm of boots crunching gravel and the distant chatter of birds. The dirt road I mentioned winds between open fields, eventually merging with a narrow lane leading into a patch of forest. At the edge of that forest stands the red chalet. I recall the first few times I passed by it, noticing the eerie atmosphere that surrounded it. Paint was peeling in various spots, and the windows were coated with a layer of dust. There was no indication of life, no cars, no lights, just emptiness. However, during one particular twilight, I glimpsed a couple standing on the veranda. My heart skipped a beat because I was convinced the place was deserted. They appeared blurred, as if I were seeing them through heat haze or a reflection in disturbed water. The man and woman stood close together, their heads slightly inclined as if they were listening to something just beyond my range of hearing. The man possibly wore a hat with a short brim, though it was too uncertain to be sure, while the woman's hair was styled in a way reminiscent of bygone eras. I blinked, and they disappeared. Strangely, their silhouettes lingered on the wall behind them, still etched in shadow as if the sun were shining directly upon them. I had no explanation for what I witnessed. I stood there, each breath catching in my throat, my heart pounding so intensely I could feel it in my neck. My palms became clammy, and although I wanted to move closer to convince myself it was merely an optical illusion, a sudden chill creeping across my back persuaded me to keep my distance. All week, I couldn't shake that memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those indistinct figures fading in and out, leaving only their dark outlines. The next time I passed by, I brought a camera, an old digital point and shoot that had never let me down. I planned to take a few pictures of the chalet and the veranda, just to see if anything unusual would appear on film. As I approached, an uneasy silence enveloped the scene. The wind had completely died down, and even the distant caws of the crows had disappeared. The chalet's door was slightly ajar, and I attempted to zoom in, but my hands were shaking so much that the lens trembled. My heart was racing, and my throat felt dry, as though each swallow was like sandpaper scraping my throat. When I pressed the shutter button, the camera beeped before flickering off, apparently a dead battery, though I had charged it just the night before. I tried switching it on again, but it powered down once more. Frustrated, I attempted to turn it on again, only to watch the lens retract automatically. It was baffling. My heart pounded as a wave of icy dread crept down my neck, causing the hair on my arms to stand on end. I muttered a string of curses under my breath, unsure if I was directing them at the camera or at my own frayed nerves. I urged myself to leave, to abandon the entire endeavor, but something irresistibly drew me forward, closer to the porch. I continued scanning for any signs of life, half expecting the couple to reappear. Instead, I found only emptiness. The floorboards were dusted with a fine layer of dirt, the wood decaying in places. I craned my neck toward one of the windows and could barely discern the outlines of furniture in the shadows. A couch or perhaps a large chair. As I stood there, straining to see more, an echoing voice seemed to emerge from within. It was low, too muffled to decipher, but it felt persistent, like a whisper born on a draft. The voice seeped into my chest, stirring a peculiar panic that made my pulse quicken until I had to catch my breath. Beads of sweat gathered at my temples, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. Though the voice faded, my unease intensified. My instincts screamed for me to flee, yet there was an inexplicable allure, a compulsion to fully open that door and gaze into the darkness. Ultimately, my better judgment triumphed. My hands trembled so violently that I struggled to keep them at my sides. My breath became labored, as if I had just finished a sprint, and I stepped back. That was enough. I walked briskly home, ignoring the unsettling feeling that something was watching me from the veranda. In the days that followed, the chalet frequently invaded my thoughts. Every time I attempted to focus on something else, whether cooking, reading, or even watching TV, my mind would drift back to that secluded building. I mentioned it to a friend in a vague, indirect manner, omitting the most peculiar details. He suggested it was likely just an old house surrounded by local legends. He advised that if I felt uneasy, I should keep my distance or perhaps speak with a neighbor who might know its history. That was the essence of his advice, shared during a brief coffee meeting. I nodded in agreement, but it did little to dispel the pervasive dread. It felt as though something had attached itself to me, an invisible tether keeping me mentally anchored to that veranda and the shadows that danced upon the wall. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I reasoned that understanding what was happening might lessen the haunting feeling. So, one late afternoon, beneath a sky bruised with the threat of a storm, I set out once more. My heart drummed a dull, heavy beat in my chest, and a cold sweat had already formed. My own footsteps echoing in the unnerving silence around me. Sweat gathered on my palms even before the chalet came into view, and I clutched my phone tightly as I walked, intermittently checking the battery to reassure myself it was fully charged. As I approached, an eerie quietness seemed to envelop the area, with no rustling leaves or distant insect hums. The chalet emerged like a phantom at the clearing's edge, its red paint appearing darker than I recalled, as if shadows had tainted it. I attempted to take photos with my phone, but this time the camera app kept crashing, each attempt ending with a black screen and an unfamiliar error message. My mouth went dry, and my throat constricted with that anxious sensation that heralds panic. The phone felt useless in my grip, a costly piece of technology that failed to function in the presence of something it couldn't comprehend. I squeezed it until my knuckles turned white, resisting the urge to hurl it into the forest. The door remained ajar, slightly more open than before, and the interior lay shrouded in darkness. From where I stood, there was no clear sign of anyone inhabiting the space, yet the air thrummed with the impression that something or someone waited inside. My legs felt unsteady, my breath quickened, and my ears buzzed with a high-pitched sound that intensified the longer I stayed frozen in place. I forced my eyes to concentrate on the doorframe, hoping to find a logical explanation, perhaps a homeless person seeking shelter or a stray cat that had wandered in. But that hope dissipated when I heard my own footsteps echoing in the unnerving silence around me. I heard those voices again, this time more distinct, yet still impossible to decipher. As I stepped onto the first porch step, the wood groaned under my weight, triggering an immediate surge of alarm in my gut. I thought I detected the faintest whisper of footsteps beyond the threshold. My heart pounded, as if striving to escape my chest. Trembling, I felt my breath become shallow, and the sweat on my brow turned icy against the evening chill. I was torn between the urge to flee and a deep curiosity to see if those indistinct figures would manifest. Summoning a fleeting burst of courage, I raised my head and peered through the doorway. A solitary corridor stretched inward, lined with peeling wallpaper that might once have displayed roses. The air inside seemed gray, as if dust motes had coalesced into a hovering cloud. I forced my eyes to adjust to the dimness. Nothing moved, yet I sensed a presence drifting nearby, so intense it made my scalp tingle. The voices persisted in their murmuring, almost as if emanating from the walls themselves. My heart thundered so violently that each pulse sent tremors through my arms and legs, and a dull ache settled at the base of my neck, making each breath a conscious effort. I resisted the urge to call out, instinct warning me that any sound might provoke something best left undisturbed. Instead, I gingerly placed one foot on the threshold. The decayed floorboard sagged slightly, and I froze. In that moment, I realized with chilling clarity how terrifyingly alone I was and how utterly unprepared. My phone was useless, and I had no idea who or what may be lurking in the darkness. I slowly retreated, every muscle tensing in anticipation of being grabbed or shoved, but nothing happened, at least nothing tangible. The hallway remained silent, save for the faint echo of those otherworldly whispers. I withdrew to the safety of the porch, feeling as though I had stepped out of a dream that left my heart racing and my skin clammy. Outside, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. Spinning around, I expected to see the couple again. Instead, I saw only the same veranda with its peeling paint. Yet the shadows on the wall shifted, as if someone had just stepped away from them. It made no sense. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear my own ragged breathing. Then, in a moment of clarity, I recalled reading somewhere that certain hauntings could exist in layers, as though time itself had fractured. My rational mind scoffed at the idea, but I couldn't deny the growing certainty that I was witnessing something trapped between dimensions. I nearly stumbled off the porch, my legs trembling. The sky had darkened considerably, the sunset was almost gone, leaving behind an oppressive twilight. I set off down the road at a brisk pace, glancing back only once. That was a mistake. The couple was there again, faint as smoke, standing on the veranda. Their faces were still blurred, but they seemed to be turned in my direction. I blinked hard, and they vanished, yet their shadows remained pressed against the chalet's wall, elongated by the dying light. It felt like a forewarning or perhaps a silent cry for assistance. Either possibility chilled my blood. For days afterward, I confined myself indoors as much as possible, but my mind clung stubbornly to the memory of what I had witnessed. Nausea would wash over me if I dwelled on it too long, and I found myself on edge, startled by even the slightest sounds in my own home. My heart would skip a beat if the floor creaked at night or if a branch scraped against a window in the wind. I questioned my sanity, wondering if stress or a mild hallucination could explain the phenomenon. Yet deep down, I feared it was real. The sensation of being observed had embedded itself in my psyche, fueling a paranoia that kept me awake at night, with sweat trickling down my back. My sense of reality felt distorted, with ordinary objects like the coat rack in the hallway suddenly appearing ominous in the corner of my eye, as though everything around me might transform into some twisted reflection of that cursed chalet. Eventually, I realized I needed closure, a definitive confrontation. If it was an illusion, I wanted to prove it. If it was something beyond my understanding, I hoped to at least comprehend enough to feel less powerless. One final time, I marched down that dirt road, ignoring the creeping dread that had become an almost tangible weight pressing on my shoulders. The sun was setting again, as it always seemed to be twilight when I ventured there, as though my visits were tethered to that liminal hour. When I arrived, the chalet was bathed in the final rays of the setting sun. The crimson walls of the house cast a shadow so deep they appeared nearly black. The porch was cloaked in shadow, and the door stood wider open than ever before, almost beckoning me to enter. As I took a step forward, my body trembled with such intensity that I had to brace myself against the railing. Under my hand, the wood felt damp and cold, sending a shiver of revulsion through me. I glanced at the wall where I had once seen those impossible silhouettes. For a fleeting moment, they flickered there, my eyes undoubtedly catching the play of darkness before they vanished. Summoning the last scraps of my courage, I ventured inside. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, and the air felt dense, as if I were wading through water. The corridor stretched out before me, leading into what might have been a living room. As I cautiously moved forward, a low, droning murmur reverberated around me, resembling a chorus of countless faint voices speaking simultaneously. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my head. My forehead was damp with sweat, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I didn't dare call out. My instincts urged me to stay silent, to remain a passive observer in this eerie domain. I passed by what appeared to be a living area where a threadbare sofa rested beneath a shattered window. The nauseating smell of damp wood and mold assaulted my senses, causing my stomach to churn. I raised an arm to shield my nose from the stench. A solitary hallway led to a staircase, its steps vanishing into the shadows above. Something shifted at the top, an indistinct figure gliding across the landing. My heart beat like a frantic drum, urging me onward. A part of me felt compelled to leave, yet a twisted curiosity demanded I stay. As I cautiously placed one foot on the staircase, a sharp crack resonated, and the step buckled beneath my weight. I managed to regain my balance just in time, adrenaline coursing through me so intensely that my vision blurred for a moment. I glanced upwards, but the mysterious figure had vanished. Nevertheless, the voices grew louder, as if I were an unwelcome intruder. My entire body quaked with raw fear. My breath had turned into ragged gasps, and my shirt adhered to my sweaty back. The sense of intrusion became unbearable. Before I fully comprehended what was happening, I found myself retreating, stumbling down the hallway and rushing out the door. My heart was pounding as if it might explode. Outside, the air felt fresher, though it was tainted with the metallic tang of my own fear. I stumbled off the porch, nearly twisting an ankle in my haste. That was when I saw them one last time. The couple in the yard, appearing as if they had emerged from the walls. Their indistinct forms drifted toward me, more hovering than walking. My mouth went bone dry, and I couldn't speak. My voice refused to cooperate. My pulse hammered in my ears, and then, with another blink, they were gone, replaced by two elongated shadows stretching across the grass, creeping toward my feet. It felt as though the house itself was alive and breathing. Instinct took over, and I ran, my lungs burning with each breath that scraped my throat. I sprinted until I reached the main road, the dirt turning to asphalt beneath me. Only then did I collapse against a nearby fence, clutching my chest as I tried to calm my frantic heartbeat. It took several minutes for me to regain control of my breathing enough to stand upright again. When I glanced back, the red chalet appeared distant, enveloped in the soft violet hues of dusk. Yet, I could still sense its undeniable pull or perhaps a newfound understanding. Something was trapped there, existing at the boundary between worlds. The couple was inexorably bound to that veranda, reappearing repeatedly like echoes from another dimension. I haven't returned since that night, but even within the safety of my own home, I remain uneasy. Occasionally, out of the corner of my eye, I think I glimpse shapes moving near my windows or catch a fleeting reflection in the mirror of two indistinct figures behind me. My heart leaps, and I whirl around, only to find empty air. My nights are plagued with restless dreams, and I wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, convinced I can hear those faint voices whispering in the hallway. Logically, I know I should put all this behind me, but a part of me can't shake the idea that whatever resides in that chalet may have followed me, or at least left its mark on me. The memory of those silhouettes on the wall, lingering long after their owners vanished, gnaws at my sanity. I can't provide a tidy conclusion. There was no climactic confrontation, no heroic expulsion of spirits, or unraveling of mysteries. I only know that the chalet still stands there, silent on that dirt road, holding within its decaying wall. LLS a rip in reality, or perhaps a time loop for those unfortunate souls who once inhabited it. I feel both relieved and horrified. Reflecting on my so-called escape, if it can indeed be called that, there's a haunting realization that strikes me. In the fleeting moments before awakening from a nightmare, I swear I can feel myself back on that verge, hearing those voices swirling around me and watching shadows contort across the walls. It is in that instant that I comprehend I am never truly liberated. The chalet remains, lurking just beneath the surface of the mundane world. All I can do is steer clear of that path, pray those phantoms remain confined to their hidden realm, and hope the day never arrives when the barrier between us thins once more. The night air felt like a damp cloth pressed against my face, heavy and suffocating. My heart raced from the moment I bolted upright in bed, my ears straining to catch the faintest sound. Even before my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I sensed it, that unnatural stillness cloaking the house, a silence so tangible it threatened to crush every ounce of my resolve. Beneath that hush, something else lingered, a subtle, elusive presence that felt alive, as though the very walls were holding their breath. It was then that I noticed my bedroom door, which had been securely latched just moments before, now standing ajar. With a single step into the hallway, a sharp chill surged up my spine, and my pulse quickened with the unsettling certainty that I was not alone. I reside in a modest, single-story home with a small living room, a cramped kitchen, a short corridor leading to the bedroom and bathroom, and a spare room I mostly use for storage. It's an older structure, possibly built in the 1950s. The house was filled with the subtle creaks and groans typical of a dwelling its age, but these noises had never troubled me before. They were like a comforting hum, a sign of the home settling into the earth, or so I believed. Lately, however, the usual shifting of wood and metal had transformed into something far more ominous. Almost every night, sometime between the stroke of midnight and the first light of dawn, I would hear the soft squeal of hinges as the internal doors in my house opened, followed by a faint click. When I got up to investigate, I would find them all flung wide open, as if an unseen visitor had just passed through each doorway. Initially, I sought rational explanations. I assumed perhaps a draft was slipping through gaps under the doors, so I taped the frames to seal any air leaks. Yet, the doors continued to open. Then, I suspected warped wood or old hinges. I replaced the hinges, installed new latches, and even wedged chairs against the doors at times. Still, I would awaken to find them unlatched and open, the chairs pushed aside by a force I couldn't perceive. The only piece of evidence suggesting that something truly unnatural might be at play arrived on a clammy, moonless night. I heard the soft scraping of a chair's legs sliding across the floor. Rushing into the hallway, I discovered the chair I had wedged under the handle was pushed at an odd angle, half-tipped yet somehow balanced in place. There were wet footprints leading from the entryway all the way to the living room, footprints so vividly outlined in moisture that they glistened under the overhead light. Yet the rest of the floor was dry, as I clearly recall. While I stood there, my eyes fixated on the tracks. My breath was unsteady, and my tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth. A chill ran down my spine, causing goosebumps to rise on my skin, and every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The footprints were nearly identical in size to mine, yet their shape was distinct, appearing elongated with toes that seemed unnaturally long, spread out as though adapted for gripping or crawling. When I reached out to touch the water, my fingers recoiled from the icy coldness. I searched the house, for leaks or any evidence of dripping from the ceiling, but there was nothing, not even a damp spot on the walls. The wet footprints came to an abrupt halt in front of the spare room. Beyond that point, no trace remained. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that I had always been a rational person, relying on science and logic in my daily life. I repeatedly assured myself that there had to be a logical explanation, and I was determined to find it. Perhaps it was an intruder, a thought that unsettled me but seemed more plausible than an otherworldly visitor. That morning, I installed new locks on every door in the house, deadbolts, latches, every security measure I could conceive. Even the interior doors received new hardware. I waited until evening, testing each lock repeatedly, making sure they stayed securely closed. Then, I pushed heavy furniture in front of every doorway. It felt excessively cautious, but I couldn't rest without taking that extra step. Around midnight, I lay awake, straining to catch any unusual sound. The house was oppressively still, the silence so profound that it made my ears ring, as if my mind were trying to fill the void with noise. In an attempt to fill the void left by the absence of sound, a monotonous static began to hum. It was during that tense vigil that I heard it, the unmistakable groan of a wooden door being forcibly opened. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, as if fear had pinned me to the mattress. My breaths became shallow, my palms were slick with cold sweat, and my mouth felt as dry as ancient parchment. Holding the flashlight in my trembling hand was a struggle. Forcing myself to investigate, I pushed back the covers. Each movement felt like an act of defiance against an unseen presence. Step by step, I ventured out of the bedroom, the flashlight's beam dancing across the narrow hallway. My mind raced with countless questions. Was I truly confined in this nightmare alone? Was something deliberately toying with me, testing my reactions? Or was my sanity unraveling under the weight of my own paranoia? The corridor's light switch was useless. An exposed bulb in the hallway usually cast a dim yet adequate glow, but now it flickered and failed to fully light up. A faint glimmer pulsed overhead, in a nauseating off-yellow hue, casting distorted shadows along the walls. My heart pounded in my ears as I noticed that every piece of furniture I had so meticulously arranged was moved. Some were merely inches from their original positions, others were halfway across the room. Doors I had locked and barricaded stood wide open, their hinges squeaking like mocking laughter. A cold breeze circulated through the corridor, yet all the windows were securely shut. My stomach twisted in confusion. Anxiety and dread. I vividly recall stepping into the spare room, feeling the swirling cold air grow more intense. It was pitch dark, the overhead light fixture having burned out months prior. The window drapes were drawn tightly, sealing the room in an inky blackness. As my flashlight beam swept across the dusty floor, I noticed peculiar marks, half-moon shapes in the dust resembling fingertips or small ridges, possibly left by an animal's paw. These marks were scattered along the baseboards, as if whatever had entered was crawling or dragging itself around the room's perimeter. The sight sent shivers down my spine, and I began to feel dizzy. My stomach churned with a nauseating wave of sheer terror. When the electrician visited the next day at my request, I struggled to keep my voice steady over the phone. I mentioned experiencing power fluctuations but avoided sharing the full story, allowing him to simply check for wiring issues. He noted that the old fuse box was intact and most circuits appeared fine, except for a small section near the corridor showing signs of unusual surges, as if there was an intermittent drain on the system. He suggested replacing some wiring and F'd by late afternoon. I remember he asked if I was feeling alright, since I kept glancing over my shoulder as though someone was lurking behind me. I assured him I was just tired. That night, the same cycle repeated, doors flung wide open, locks unlatched. I heard the scraping of wood and the rattling of doorknobs. Each sound intensified my nerves until my entire body vibrated with anxiety. A nearly unbearable tension filled the air as my bedroom door creaked open just a sliver, only for me to slam it closed and lock it, only to find it ajar hours later. Sleep became a distant memory. Every noise jolted me awake. Even the gentle hum of the refrigerator sent me into a panic. I developed a pounding headache from the lack of rest, and my nerves felt stretched to their breaking point. I began to wonder if I was losing my sanity. Could I possibly be sleepwalking, unlocking everything, and methodically leaving those damp footprints without realizing it? But then I recalled the size and shape of those prints. No human foot resembled them. Yet, the alternative explanation was terrifying. Some presence roamed my home under the cloak of darkness, unstoppable and unseen. Driven by a need to capture evidence of these occurrences, I set up an old camera on a tripod in the hallway, directed at the entrance to the living room. Lacking a proper night vision camera, I improvised by attaching a flashlight to ensure some illumination. I also spread towels across the floor, hoping to see them disturbed if anything, or anyone, passed over them. My plan was to stay awake all night, watching the area in real time, and recording any movement. For hours, nothing happened. I sat hunched in my chair, eyes fixed on the small monitor, as the monotony of waiting lulled me into a restless state of semi-consciousness. Despite my efforts to resist, my eyelids grew unbearably heavy, and the steady whir of the camera's internal motor hummed a mechanical lullaby. Eventually, I succumbed. Eventually, I surrendered, perhaps only for a fleeting moment, but it was enough. Upon abruptly waking, I was paralyzed by the sight of my own reflection in the dim monitor. The camera feed had ceased, and a wave of panic constricted my chest. In a frantic rush, I scrambled to my feet and dashed to the camera. Although the power switch remained on, the attached flashlight had extinguished. The towels scattered on the floor appeared as if someone had kicked them in exasperation. A surge of fear coursed through me, my ears pounding so intensely that I was nearly deafened. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and my legs trembled uncontrollably. My breathing came in quick, sharp gasps as I attempted to adjust the camera. It was as if the battery had been completely drained. When I turned around, the door to the spare room was slightly ajar, despite my certainty that I had previously closed it securely. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that it was difficult to think. Inside the spare room, the air felt dense, heavier, and charged with an inexplicable energy that tingled along my arms. As I shone a flashlight around, I noticed the entire room had been rearranged. Boxes that had been stacked in one corner were now overturned, their contents strewn across the floor. An old mirror leaning against the wall lay shattered, its fragments reflecting the unsteady beam of my flashlight. In the far corner, I caught a glimpse of something I could only describe as a faint shimmer, akin to the heat haze rising from asphalt on a blistering day, but twisted into a vaguely human shape. It flickered and vanished almost immediately. My heart pounded against my ribs, and for a brief moment, I questioned my sanity more than ever. I tried convincing myself that I must have been imagining it. Perhaps the reflection from my flashlight had oddly danced on the shattered glass. Yet, deep down, I knew I had seen something. I felt its presence in the very marrow of my bones. An ancient kind of dread that defied rational explanation. That marked a turning point for me. My fear intensified from mere anxiety to full-blown paranoia. I began triple-checking every door, testing each lock at least a dozen times before going to bed. I even started sleeping with the hallway light on, not that it made much difference. Some nights, the corridor light would flicker out on its own, plunging me into a darkness so thick I could almost taste it. Other times, an overwhelming sensation of being watched would jolt me awake, leaving me drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and adrenaline surging through my veins. When friends from work asked why I was so jumpy, I dodged their questions. When they pressed, I offered vague explanations about insomnia and stress. One coworker suggested I see a therapist, and I nodded politely. Inside, I was torn between wanting professional help and fearing that a doctor would label me delusional. The problem was that everything felt too real. I could still feel the doorknobs twisting in the dead of night, hear the distinct rattling of brass against wood, and sense a presence pacing my halls, testing each door as if waiting for me to emerge. Unable to cope any longer, I resolved to make one final stand. I would confront WH. Whatever haunted my home, I spent an entire week preparing myself. I delved into online research about cleansing rituals, smudging with sage, and filling bowls with salt to place at thresholds. I also explored warding symbols, even though I didn't hold any profound belief in them. Yet, in my desperation, I was willing to try anything, regardless of how superstitious it appeared. I adorned the windows with new curtains, hoping to block out the unknown. Each night, I lit candles and wandered through every room, reciting mantras I had committed to memory. I can't truly say I believed these rituals would work, but they provided a sense of purpose, a feeling that I was at least attempting to fight back. During the first few nights of this ritual, the activity seemed to wane. The doors remained closed, though the locks felt loose, as if they were being turned from the other side. The tension in the air persisted, but it was subdued, like a caged animal biding its time. I allowed myself a glimmer of hope and tried to get some genuine rest, though I should have known better. On the final night of my improvised cleansing, I was abruptly awakened by the unmistakable squeal of hinges, a sound so loud it cleaved the silence like a knife. My bedroom door flew open with such violent force that it slammed against the wall. My eyes snapped open, and my entire body was seized with terror as I sat up, flashlight in hand, sweat trickling down my temples. The hallway was illuminated with a sickly glow from the lamp I had left on. My stomach twisted into knots as I noticed something impossible. Large, strangely shaped footprints of water, leading from the center of the living room. As I approached the edge of my bedroom, every step glistened under the lamp's pale glow, radiating with an ethereal brilliance. A strangled sound, caught between a gasp and a cry, escaped my lips. Standing at the doorway, I finally beheld a figure. It was the same faint glimmer I had noticed in the spare room, but now the outline was more distinct. Though translucent, it possessed a vaguely human silhouette, tall and disturbingly warped, as if every joint bent at an unnatural angle. For a single heartbeat, it remained motionless, and I was immobilized by its sheer alien presence. My breath was shallow, my limbs quivered uncontrollably, and cold sweat drenched my shirt. Every hair on my body stood up in primitive terror. Then, without warning, the figure moved, not forward, not backward, but it seemed to pulse, vanishing from sight only to reappear a foot closer. My heart thudded harder than I ever thought possible, my vision blurring at the edges. I managed to direct the flashlight right at it. That was when I recoiled, emitting a hiss that I sensed more than heard, like a crackling static echoing inside my skull. Acting on instinct, I stumbled backward, nearly falling onto my bed. Summoning the last remnants of my courage, I forced myself to move. With each step, my legs threatened to buckle from the intense fear coursing through them, but I retreated into the hallway, keeping the flashlight's beam trained on the entity, ignoring the dryness in my throat and the pounding of my pulse with every heartbeat. The pounding in my ears felt like a relentless drumbeat. The figure recoiled, then swiftly vanished around the corner, heading toward the spare room. I heard frantic rattling, followed by a door slamming, and then an absolute silence enveloped the space. Standing there, panting, with my mind on the brink of panic, I finally felt the adrenaline give way to exhaustion. It dawned on me that this was my opportunity. If that entity was retreating, I had to seize the moment to leave. I needed to abandon the house, at least temporarily, no matter how irrational it seemed. Hastily, I grabbed the essentials. A bag I had packed days prior, car keys clutched in my trembling hand, and dashed outside. My lungs filled with the cool night air, and for the first time in weeks, the suffocating oppression lifted, replaced by a vast emptiness. I drove until I reached a motel on the outskirts of town, where the neon lights hummed and flickered. My nerves were still on edge, my hands quivering as I checked into a small room with worn-out furniture. Lying on that rigid bed, I expected relief, but was instead confronted by a disturbing realization. The presence wasn't necessarily confined to my house. It seemed somehow linked to me, or to some intangible connection between us. Even as I drifted into sleep, haunted by visions of watery footprints and that glimmering silhouette, I sensed I hadn't truly escaped. To this day, I haven't returned to the house for more than a few hours at a time, always in daylight. I check the mailbox, ensure no stray animals have broken in, and everything appears eerily undisturbed on the surface. Furniture in place, floors dry, doors closed. But the tension lingers. The tension hangs heavily in every corner, whispering that nothing has truly shifted. Standing in the living room, I sense the same invisible presence observing my every movement, as though the walls themselves possess eyes. I quickly secure everything and rush out, my heart racing until I'm safely on the road, the house diminishing in my rearview mirror. I'm uncertain if I'll ever find peace again. The open doors, the footprints, the warped shapes, these memories cling to me like shadows, creeping into my mind with each nightfall. A part of me dreads the day I choose to confront whatever resides there once more, yet another part insists that I must face it eventually. This entity, whatever it may be, has already entrenched itself in my fears, in my thoughts, waiting for my return. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night in the motel, I can still hear the slow creak of a door slowly opening, beckoning me back into that darkness. From the moment I first entered that cramped apartment, a cold wave of unease washed over me. It was as if the air itself had chosen to resist our presence, opposing each breath I took. The hallway leading to our door was narrow and perpetually shrouded in shadows, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, which seemed ready to burn out at any moment. The faint hum of electricity made my skin tingle, and the stale smell of dust mingled with faint mildew clung to every inch of the space. My roommate, whom we'll call Miguel, was already placing boxes in the living area, but I hardly noticed. My attention was captured by an odd, almost a barely perceptible draft seemed to wander through the apartment as if guided by an unseen hand, creating the eerie sensation that the space itself was breathing, exhaling air in uneven gusts, hinting at a life far beyond what an apartment should possess. Back then, I was a college student, brimming with nervous excitement at the prospect of living on my own for the first time. Or at least as independently as one could in a cramped two-room apartment shared with another person. The building itself was from a bygone era, possibly older, its wooden floors groaning unexpectedly beneath our feet. Every sound within those walls felt intimate, like footsteps echoing in the stillness of night, even though no one lived above us. Occasionally, my heart would race at the mere sound of the walls shifting, producing faint creaks that would send my imagination into overdrive. Initially, I attempted to dismiss these occurrences as the charming quirks of an old building, but deep down, the apartment tugged at my consciousness, as if harboring a secret it was not yet ready to disclose. During that first week, minor incidents began accumulating. At night, when the wind gusted against our street-facing window, it was normal to hear a gentle rattle. However, there were far too many instances when no wind blew at all, yet the window would tremble so violently that I would awaken, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding fiercely within my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I would stare at the moonlit glass, half convinced it might shatter if it shook any harder. Each time I approached, the rattling would suddenly cease. The abrupt cessation left me unsure whether the sound had been genuine or a figment of my imagination, conjured by my own nervousness. Although I endeavored to dismiss these occurrences, more peculiarities soon emerged. Small items began vanishing, only to reappear in the most nonsensical locations. My keys turned up in the bathroom sink, and my phone ended up in the tiny broom closet near the kitchen. Miguel would occasionally grumble, convinced he had placed his textbooks on the desk, yet later found them stacked behind the living room couch. We never witnessed these objects moving, never caught them suspended in midair. It was as if they slipped through space whenever we averted our eyes. Each instance sent a shiver of unease coursing through my veins, like ice creeping beneath my skin. My logical mind insisted there must be a reasonable explanation, stress, forgetfulness, or perhaps we were merely disorganized, but that rationale felt insubstantial, especially when I noticed heavier objects, like a lamp, shifted from the corner table to the center of the living room floor. A quiet voice inside me whispered that these events were far from normal. The nightly disturbances soon intensified. Our compact kitchen was separated from the living room by a flimsy folding door that screeched if opened too quickly. One evening, while I was alone, I sat at our worn dining table, attempting to concentrate on some coursework. The overhead light flickered in slow pulses, amplifying my mounting headache, and the sporadic blare of car horns outside only heightened my tension. Suddenly, a crashing sound echoed from the living room, causing my heart to skip a beat. Muscles tautened as a sudden surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins. My throat went dry as I stood up to investigate. The living room lamp lay on the floor, the bulb slowly spiraling around its base. There was no evidence of forced entry, no indication that an intruder had rifled through our possessions. The window was securely locked, and the chain on the door remained fastened. I could scarcely swallow as my heart hammered so violently it seemed as though it might burst from my chest. Something unseen had toppled that lamp, and I couldn't conjure a single logical explanation for it. I remember how the nights grew progressively worse from then on. Numerous times I awoke to the unsettling sensation of my mattress shifting slightly, as if someone had just sat down beside me. More than once, I jolted upright in bed, sweat trickling down my neck, convinced that something or someone lingered in the shadows, silently observing me breathe. The oppressive feeling of being watched made my skin crawl, and occasionally I could have sworn I heard soft, whisper-like sounds, as if someone were standing mere inches from my ear. Yet, whenever I flicked on the lamp, the room was empty, an unwelcome silence enveloping me. Miguel began to mention that he too sensed something was amiss. He confided in a tense, subdued voice that he believed we might have an invisible cohabitant sharing the apartment with us. He seldom spoke of it directly, as the topic unsettled him, but I could discern that his usually calm demeanor was beginning to fracture. On one occasion, he approached me looking pale, as though he hadn't slept in days, and said, "In my chest," and a cold shiver raced down my spine. The unsettling noise of the door creaking open in the dead of night was followed by the unmistakable sound of labored breaths just beyond the headboard. It took me more than an hour to muster the bravery to flick on the lamp beside my bed. Every time he recounted his encounters, my own anxiety surged, feeding my suspicion that we were contending with something beyond our comprehension. Gradually, I started to question the boundary between reality and illusion. I found myself doubting ordinary occurrences, a subtle shift in air pressure, the creak of a door hinge, or even the hum of the refrigerator. Every sound seemed menacing, and every shadow in the corridor seemed to mock me. My skin prickled with goosebumps whenever I caught sight of a dim corner, convinced that something might be lurking just beyond my line of sight. My mouth remained perpetually dry from the stress, and my shoulders ached from being in a constant state of vigilance. Sometimes, I couldn't focus on my studies at all. My thoughts would drift back to that suffocating apartment, replaying each disquieting moment in an endless cycle I couldn't escape. One night was particularly unforgettable. The wind outside had intensified, howling through the ancient windows as if possessed by a fury demanding entry. I remember the perspiration gathering at the small of my back as I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with some reading. Miguel had gone out to buy groceries, leaving me alone. Suddenly, the living room window began to shudder so violently that the curtains billowed inward, entangling themselves in a wild, chaotic dance. My heart leapt in my chest, and a cold shiver raced down my spine. A surge of adrenaline shot up my spine, causing my breath to catch in my throat. I frantically attempted to grasp the edges of the curtain, but the gust that swept into the apartment felt unnaturally cold, clinging to my skin rather than merely brushing past it. My teeth nearly chattered from the sudden drop in temperature, even though the evening was relatively mild. Then, as suddenly as it began, the wind subsided, and the rattling stopped, leaving only the rapid thud of my pulse echoing in my ears. I switched on every light I could find, trembling in place and trying to regain my composure. That's when I noticed a handprint smeared in dark grime on the wall near the window. It resembled soot or black dust, each finger's imprint clearly visible. The sight made my skin crawl, and my breath came in a series of uneven gasps. The shape was far too large to be my hand, and it didn't match Miguel's either. My knees felt weak as I moved closer, struggling in vain to rationalize how it could have appeared. I reached out, my hand trembling so violently that I could scarcely keep it steady. The soot felt slightly damp, despite its resemblance to old ash, and a wave of nausea twisted through my stomach, prompting me to pull back immediately. I felt that same draft creeping under my clothes again, making me shiver. There was no one else in the apartment that night. I was absolutely certain of that. So how did a phantom hand manage to imprint itself onto our wall? By the time Miguel returned, I was still standing there, staring at the print, barely able to comprehend what had happened. He asked in a muted, anxious voice if I had turned on all the lights. I watched as he hurried to the bathroom, frantically scrubbing his hands, as though he could cleanse himself of the guilt of our predicament. Deep down, we both recognized it wasn't something ordinary. It was a malevolent force, thriving on our fear and uncertainty, growing bolder as it manipulated our minds. I felt trapped within my own home, weighed down by an oppressive dread that seeped into every fiber of my being. Desperate to dispel the suffocating darkness, I whispered prayers before bed, mumbling invocations I barely recalled from childhood. I left lamps illuminated throughout the apartment, hoping the light would repel the lurking shadows. Miguel and I kept the television on at a low volume all night, trying to drown out the unsettling silence. Yet the disturbances persisted, as if the entity, or whatever it was, knew precisely how to prey on our fears. Our nerves were so frayed that each new incident felt like a stab to our collective sanity. Every muscle in my body tensed at the slightest hint of movement. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my head throbbed incessantly. I feared I might collapse from sheer exhaustion. The more drained I became, the more my perception seemed to distort. Occasionally, in the periphery of my vision, I thought I saw a shape flicker, a tall, hunched silhouette that vanished whenever I turned my head. My reflection in the bathroom mirror appeared gaunt and pale, with dark circles under my eyes. Had no choice but to confront the reality that staying there was no longer viable. The dark circles beneath my eyes rendered me ill-looking, leading me to question my own memories, especially in the absence of Miguel to verify them. I attempted to dismiss the persistent sensation that the walls were encroaching upon me, yet the claustrophobic anxiety was overpowering. Every nook of the apartment felt imbued with an ominous presence, as though the entire living space had become a snare set for my sanity. One late evening, I encountered the most intense episode of fear I had experienced up to that point. The overhead lights flickered ominously, and a shrill noise, akin to nails scraping down a chalkboard, ripped through the hallway connecting my bedroom to the living room. My heart rate soared, and I broke into a cold sweat, every sense heightened to the brink. My breathing became so rapid that I felt weighed down. The door to my bedroom slammed shut of its own volition, and I nearly leapt out of my skin. Fear surged through my veins like a wildfire, leaving my limbs shaking uncontrollably. I stood frozen for a fleeting moment, convinced that if I opened that door, I would be confronted by something lurking on the other side, waiting for me. It took what seemed like an eternity to muster the courage to turn the handle. By the time I finally did, the living room was once again still, bathed in that stale artificial light that seemed impotent against the darkness encroaching from the corners. That was the final nudge Miguel and I needed. We could no longer deceive ourselves into thinking that circumstances might improve or that we could withstand the escalating anxiety. The apartment was consuming our peace of mind, draining us both physically and mentally. Therefore, I made the resolute choice to move out, determined to abandon everything rather than remain in a place that felt undeniably sinister. Gathering our belongings was a chaotic endeavor. With each step, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I would see that soot-stained hand or a lurking shadow beckoning me from across the room. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts, adrenaline coursing through my veins as we loaded box after box into our car. The corridor outside felt no safer, its dim light swinging overhead, yet it was still preferable to being trapped. Ped inside with the malevolent force that had claimed our living space. On the final night, I slept in my clothes, too tense to change. I kept every lamp on, though it did nothing to prevent the unnatural chills that tingled the back of my neck. Sleep eventually overtook me, but it was restless, filled with fragmented nightmares and enigmatic figures whispering in the darkness. In the early hours of the morning, I jolted awake. For a moment, I thought I heard a ragged breath just inches from my ear, but it might have been my own panicked inhalation. My pulse pounded and my chest felt constricted, as if I were drawing breath through a straw. I clung to the last shred of bravery I possessed and waited for the sun to rise. At dawn, we carried out the final boxes. The sight of daylight helped calm my nerves, yet I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that the apartment was observing our departure. It was as though something had pressed its presence against the windows, tracking our every move, waiting for an opportunity. As I locked the door for the final time, my heart pounded heavily in my chest. The corridor reeked of stale air, a faint blend of mildew mingling with grime. It felt like a desolate, empty space, yet the overwhelming sense of liberation I experienced upon stepping outside was immense. We had escaped. We hadn't dispelled the darkness, but we refused to let it hold any more power over us. Even now, I can't definitively say what haunted that cramped apartment. It might have been a sinister entity feeding on fear, or perhaps it was my imagination turning ordinary creaks and groans into a living nightmare. Still, even after all these years, a part of me is convinced that place was alive in a terrifying, voracious manner. The memory continues to send shivers crawling across my skin when I think of that eerie handprint on the wall or recall the echo of phantom footsteps in the dark. I'll never completely erase the sensation of being watched or the tense ache that settled in my shoulders while living there. Sometimes, I wake from dreams where I'm back in that suffocating space. In those dreams, I struggle to switch on the lights, but the bulbs are always flickering or going out, leaving me unable to see what lurks just beyond the doorway. My mouth goes dry, and my heart pounds so loudly it drowns out everything else. When I finally open my eyes to my current surroundings, relief washes over me, but a disquieting sense of residual dread lingers, reminding me of what once transpired. It's a persistent, unsettling legacy of that foreboding apartment, a warning that some places are simply wrong. Into a dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly, as though it existed solely to consume the spirits of anyone who dared enter. Whether it was genuinely supernatural or merely a projection of my most profound fears, that place altered me. No matter how much time has elapsed, I cannot escape the memory of those nights enveloped in oppressive darkness, pursued by an unseen presence. Although I managed to flee, the recollection of its cold, lingering breath on the back of my neck remains with me. I arrived at my uncle's estate on a night so tranquil that every footstep seemed to reverberate against the walls of the silent countryside. Clouds obscured the moonlight, leaving only the faint glow of a solitary porch lamp flickering like a faltering heartbeat. My initial thought was to turn back and head home, yet I had promised my uncle I would look after his property. Ignoring the unsettling sense of foreboding was my first mistake, as I disregarded my instincts. I'm not a man given to superstition. I've always prided myself on my rationality. Yet, from the moment I stepped onto the grounds, a suffocating silence pressed down on me. The air felt stagnant and cold, as if the very atmosphere was hesitant to allow me to breathe. I tried to attribute it to nerves, given the late hour and the property's isolation from the nearest town. Nevertheless, the unease clung to me persistently, causing the hair on my arms to stand on end. On my first night, I wandered through each room of the modest house to acquaint myself with it. The living room featured large windows overlooking a patio, which led to a stretch of wild grass and then into a dense forest that appeared to extend indefinitely. Beyond the cluster of trees lay an expansive stretch of barren acreage. The house itself was unremarkable, featuring worn rugs, rustic wooden furniture, and an enormous fireplace constructed from dark stones. Yet, there was something about that fireplace that immediately captured my attention, as if it were silently calling to me. The drive to the property had been long and exhausting, so I decided to retire to bed early. Before doing so, I ensured that every door and window was securely locked. I switched off the living room light, trying to ignore the echo that seemed to breathe within the chimney's depths. It sounded like a faint draft, yet it sent shivers down my spine. I compelled myself upstairs, reminding myself there was nothing to fear. Later that night, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of laughter, a low, raspy chuckle floating through the stillness just outside my window. My heart nearly stopped, and my mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a transient passerby, or maybe an animal making an unusual noise. Holding my breath, I glanced at the clock, 2:49 a.m. The laughter quickly faded, as if smothered by the oppressive night air. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but heard nothing further. It was just me, alone in that dark bedroom, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning brought a fragile sense of comfort as sunlight filtered through the curtains, making the house feel less intimidating. I tried to convince myself that the laughter had merely been a dream. As I descended the stairs into the living room, an inexplicable unease began to twist within my stomach. Something about the space seemed wrong. It took a moment before I noticed it. The ashes in the fireplace had arranged themselves into what appeared to be crude symbols, geometric shapes, and spirals scattered across the charred stone. My chest constricted as if some enigmatic message had been etched into the hearth. The peculiar aspect was that the ashes appeared freshly disturbed. I reassured myself that perhaps my uncle had simply lit a fire before leaving, and the patterns were just coincidental formations in the soot. Nevertheless, the sight unsettled me enough to grab a metal brush to sweep away the ashes. The instant I touched them, a barely audible hiss reached my ears, almost like a voice whispering, "Don't do that." My breath hitched, and I froze, adrenaline surging through my veins, my heart pounding so fiercely I feared it might explode. I stood there for several moments, battling to maintain my composure. Then, I compelled myself to overcome the fear and clear the ashes away. I refused to let my imagination take control. Later that same afternoon, I walked around the property to ensure there truly wasn't anyone lurking nearby. The rustic fence at the perimeter had a few gaps, but none were large enough for a person to slip through easily. The gate was locked, with no signs of forced entry. The yard was silent, the grass so tall that a gentle breeze made it sway like ocean waves. Standing outside under the muted sun, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Turning around multiple times, I half expected to catch sight of a face pressed against the window or a figure darting behind the trees. Yet, I was met only with an expanse of emptiness and silence. I spent the rest of the day tidying up the house, attempting to focus my mind on other tasks. Occasionally, the electricity would flicker, overhead lights dimmed, End surge. At one point, the kitchen light bulb burst, plunging the room into darkness, the sound startling me so much that I dropped a glass on the floor. My heart was still racing from the day's unsettling events, and now I had the additional hassle of cleaning up shattered glass. By evening, I had lost all appetite. As dusk settled, the property assumed a more ominous air. The trees, once tranquil, now cast elongated shadows that stretched across the yard like skeletal fingers. I closed all the curtains and switched on every light in an attempt to dispel the gloom, but the erratic electrical supply made the lighting unreliable. The lamps emitted a feeble glow, sometimes flickering at the periphery of my vision, making it feel as though I was living inside a failing lighthouse, each flicker threatening to plunge me into darkness. That night, I tried to distract myself by watching old television reruns. The static made it barely viewable, but it was preferable to the oppressive silence pressing against the windows. Around midnight, the power went out for about 30 seconds. My lungs seized as I sat in a blind, suffocating void. I was certain I heard movement just outside the living room window, the shuffle of feet, perhaps. Then, the lights flickered back on, and the television sprang to life with a crackling noise that almost made me jump off the couch. I spent the following hour with my heart pounding at twice its normal rate, too scared to move. On the third day, I inspected the fireplace once more. The ashes I had previously removed were back, not arranged as before but scattered into new, equally peculiar patterns. I felt a chill emanating from the hearth, as if a draft of wintry air was seeping from some hidden recess. My hands shook, and sweat gathered at my temples. The tension in my stomach made me feel queasy. I told myself that my uncle must have left some flue open, allowing the ashes to be blown around, but I couldn't dismiss the possibility that something else was at play. Something not of this world, or at least beyond any logic I understood. I was desperate for reassurance, so I used my cell phone to call a friend back in town and describe the strange noises and laughter to her. She suggested it could be the wind or animals outside, or perhaps even a trick of my own exhausted mind. Her calm voice provided a small measure of comfort, but it didn't quell the dread gnawing at me. After we ended the call, the house felt emptier than ever, as if it resented me for seeking help. By evening, the anxiety had become physically exhausting. My palms were constantly clammy, and every sound startled me like an electric shock. Around twilight, I decided I needed a distraction. I grabbed a broom to sweep the patio, convincing myself that some physical activity might clear my mind. Outside, the sky was a bruised mix of purple and gray, and a cold wind rattled the trees as I swept the porch. Out of the corner of my eye, I glimpsed something darting along the fence, a fleeting shadow, dark against the field's backdrop. My heart raced, and I gripped the broom as if it were a weapon, stepping forward to see if I could spot it once more. But there was nothing, just the rustling grass. I hurried inside and slammed the door behind me. My breathing was uneven, and I felt my pulse pounding in my temples. The eerie laughter that had haunted me didn't return that night, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I paced the living room, occasionally casting nervous glances at the fireplace. Each time I passed it, a tingling chill crept up my spine, as though something stirred within, an unseen presence observing me with invisible eyes. With each circuit of the room, the chill grew stronger until I could scarcely bring myself to approach that side of the room. The house seemed to feed off my fear, making the air feel stale and metallic. Later, the electricity began to flicker once again, the light bulbs dimming before surging, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. My breath became shallow, cold sweat clinging to my neck. The oppressive silence of the property enveloped everything, and my thoughts began to race. I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. Logic insisted that none of this was possible, that there had to be a rational explanation, a faulty electrical system, a draft in the chimney, perhaps just a figment of my imagination. Yet, every instinct in my body screamed that something malevolent lurked here, feeding on my dread. Having resolved to depart the following morning, I had reasoned that I would contact my uncle, explain the persistent power issues, and inform him that I could no longer stay. No job was worth enduring such terror. Unfortunately, the night had its own agenda. Around 3 a.m., a noise of something scraping against the walls downstairs jarred me from a restless sleep. My heart thumped so loudly it resembled the thunderous beat of war drums in my ears. Grabbing a flashlight, I cautiously descended the stairs, forcing myself to investigate. As I reached the living room, I swept the light across the walls. There, near the fireplace, I noticed faint scratch marks, as if someone had dragged their fingernails across the stone. My stomach churned, and my throat tightened. The electricity had failed once more, casting the room in shadowy darkness. I couldn't bring myself to move closer. I stood there, frozen, with the flashlight trembling in my hand. My mouth was so dry that swallowing was nearly impossible. Then, a new sound emerged, a raspy hush, like a distant whisper, pressing against my eardrums. Instinctively, I wanted to flee, but my body refused to cooperate, immobilized by fear as if the house itself wanted me to witness whatever was lurking there. The chill emanating from the fireplace became sharper, cutting through the room's humidity, causing my teeth to chatter uncontrollably. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered off, enveloping me in complete darkness. My pulse raced, and I anticipated hearing that mocking laughter again or the hiss urging me to stop what I was doing. But this time, it was a deep, guttural sound that reached me. That seemed to scrape the inside of my skull. In that blind moment, I could almost perceive the shape of a presence within my mind's eye, twisted and formless, all-consuming. For a few agonizing seconds, the air felt dense, too heavy to inhale, and my lungs screamed in protest. Then, with a spark and a hum, the power returned. My flashlight flickered back to life, and the living room lights glowed weakly overhead, revealing only my own reflection in the windows. My hands were trembling so violently that the beam of light danced across the walls in erratic patterns. The scratch marks on the stone appeared deeper now, as though fresh cuts had been added while the lights were out. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to abandon the house right then and there. I rushed upstairs, threw my clothes into a backpack, and nearly tripped down the steps in my haste to reach the front door. As I passed the fireplace one last time, I heard that faint hiss again, a sibilant warning that coiled around my ears. It felt like a final attempt to keep me from leaving. Outside, the wind had picked up, bending the trees at unnatural angles, and the sky churned with thick clouds. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys, sweat streaming down my face. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my hands shook so violently that it took me 3 tries to insert the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I breathed a shaky sigh of relief and pressed the accelerator, leaving the property behind me. However, the escape provided no real comfort, even with the headlights illuminating the road ahead. As the headlights illuminated the path ahead, I couldn't help but repeatedly glance at the rearview mirror, half convinced that I would spot a formless presence lurking in the backseat. My imagination played tricks on me, conjuring fleeting silhouettes at the periphery of my vision, leaving every nerve in my body on high alert. The sound of my blood rushing in my ears was so overwhelming that coherent thought became a challenge. My grasp on reality had been shattered by that house. When I finally returned to my apartment, I locked the door and sat in the dark, attempting to soothe my frayed nerves. Even the simple act of breathing felt like an ordeal. Each time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by the memory of that rasping voice, the ominous symbols in the ashes, and the laughter echoing outside my window. Sleep came in fragmented, restless bouts, tormented by half-formed nightmares. The next morning, I discovered fresh scratches on my arm. Although not deep, they formed the same kind of spirals I had seen in the ashes of the fireplace. I had no memory of inflicting them upon myself, nor could I recall any incident that might have caused them. I never revealed to my uncle the full extent of what transpired. I merely mentioned that the electrical system was failing and that I felt uneasy staying there alone. He appeared perplexed but refrained from probing further. Yet, even now, whenever I find myself in a silent room, I instinctively check the corners and listen for any sounds that seem out of place. Late at night, if I catch the faintest hint of laughter in the distance, my chest tightens with a familiar panic. Something embedded itself within me during those nights at the estate. A persistent gnawing at my peace of mind serves as a constant reminder that certain places and presences exist beyond our comfortable understanding of reality. I'm still uncertain about what I encountered. Whether it was a spirit, a manifestation of fear, or something far more ancient and inexplicable. I can't definitively say, but I am sure of this. Once you feel that icy chill creeping over your skin and sense that gaze lingering on you when no one is around, life is never quite the same again. I managed to escape that property, yet sometimes, in the darkness of my own home, I still ponder whether I truly left whatever it was behind or if it followed me, clinging to my shadow and whispering in my nightmares. It all began with an unsettling weight in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath the moment I first stepped inside this old two-story dwelling. Something about the silence twisted my stomach. It was not the typical quiet of an empty building. Instead, it felt charged with a presence I couldn't identify. The lights in the corridor seemed dimmer than they ought to be, as if an unseen hand were subtly turning the bulbs down a notch. Every shadow stretched and contorted in unnatural ways. Even my own reflection in the hallway mirror appeared subtly askew. There was an immediate impression that I was not alone, that something older and heavier lingered beneath the floorboards and above the ceilings. Initially, I dismissed this sensation as a product of my overactive imagination. But from that day forward, the house, and particularly the attic, set the stage for nights filled with dread. I cannot fully articulate it, but I recall the first night I slept here. The bedroom was uncomfortably chilly, even with the windows firmly shut. I attributed the initial draft to the autumn breeze, yet it seemed too cold for a mild evening. Each breath I took caught in my throat, compelling me to exhale in short, cautious breaths. The hallway's overhead light flickered intermittently, leaving me with the unsettling sensation that something was lurking just beyond the circle of illumination. The house shifted and groaned in the dark, as old structures often do. But there was a particular series of thumping noises I couldn't ignore. They originated from above, heavy, deliberate footsteps, slow and methodical. I attempted to convince myself that I was imagining things or perhaps hearing echoes from a neighbor's home. The pacing was too distinct, resonating precisely above me in the attic. As I lay in bed, I found myself straining to hear more, to discern the exact pattern. Indeed, it was a slow, purposeful tread that would pause momentarily, then resume. It felt as though someone or something was prowling back and forth with a specific intent. When morning finally arrived, I was eager to convince myself it had all been a dream or some acoustic illusion. I resolved that day to inspect the attic, to see if any animals had made a nest there. Rational explanations were my lifeline. After locating the pull cord for the retractable ladder in the ceiling of the upstairs corridor, I braced myself and pulled. The ladder creaked open like an ancient secret, the dusty wooden rungs extending downward. A musty aroma permeated the air as I ventured into the attic, flashlight gripped tightly in my hand. A faint light trickled through a small, circular window at one end of the attic, but aside from this, everything lay swathed in shadow. The atmosphere felt dense, clogging my nostrils with the scent of ancient insulation and centuries-old dust. As I swept the beam of my flashlight across the wooden floorboards, I noticed footprints, a trail of distinct impressions in the dust, leading from the far corner to the center of the room. My heart pounded so fiercely that I could hear its rhythm echoing in my ears. Each footprint was larger than my own shoe, appearing fresh, with the dust noticeably disturbed. However, there were no returning prints, no indication that whoever made them had ever left. They ceased abruptly, as if the creator had vanished into thin air right in the middle of the attic. I stood in stunned silence, convincing myself it had to be a prank. Perhaps some prior tenant or a contractor had left those prints before I moved in. Yet, the dryness in my mouth and the sudden cold sweat clinging to my scalp hinted at a different reality. I felt observed, as though I had intruded upon a private domain. For a fleeting moment, I could have sworn I heard a soft exhale nearby, just at the edge of my hearing range. My arms erupted in goosebumps, and I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam flickered against the distant wall, revealing nothing but aged planks and dust motes floating in the stagnant air. Still, the sensation of being watched lingered, unrelenting. As swiftly as I could manage, I backed toward the opening. As I placed one foot on the ladder, my heart pounded so fiercely against my ribs that I wondered if its thunderous rhythm could be heard in the attic silence. Suddenly, the ladder jerked upward and snapped shut of its own volition, nearly crushing my fingers. I stumbled backward with a strangled yelp, barely regaining my balance before I could topple over completely. The hatch door slammed shut, plunging the attic into darkness, and panic surged through me like a jolt of electricity. I pounded on the hatch and fumbled for the latch mechanism, but it seemed jammed. My breathing grew frantic, consisting of short, rapid gasps that refused to fill my lungs. I'm not sure how many seconds or minutes passed before the hatch suddenly flew open, as if released by unseen hands. The ladder clattered down, allowing me to scramble back into the corridor, where I collapsed on the floor, legs trembling and mouth dry. It felt as though I had narrowly escaped a predator's lair. I tried to collect myself, leaning against the wall and running a shaky hand through my hair. My heart was still pounding, and my vision swam from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. After a few moments, I forced myself to stand. The corridor seemed darker than before, even though the light was on. An irrational part of me wondered if something had followed me down. I glanced up at the hatch. It remained open, but the very thought of going back up there made my pulse race. Deciding I had had enough, I carefully pushed the ladder back into place and closed the hatch. I tried to lock it. Yet there was no genuine lock, merely a simple latch that anything or anyone on the opposite side could easily push open. After that, an unshakable sensation of being observed settled over the house. Each night, the footsteps returned. They began as a soft shuffle, gradually building into a pounding stride that caused the light fixtures on the ceiling to tremble. I endured several sleepless nights, sitting up in bed with blankets clutched tightly to my chest, straining my ears against the darkness, my shoulders tensing at each heavy step, expecting it to halt right above my bedroom. Sometimes it did, and in those instances of utter silence, I could sense a presence hovering as if peering down through the ceiling. On the rare occasions I managed to drift into sleep, my dreams morphed into a distorted echo of the real torment. I dreamed of the attic ladder descending on its own, and fleeting glimpses of an unseen figure pacing the floors overhead, featureless yet somehow exuding a malevolent anticipation. The house itself appeared to respond. Doors that once remained closed now drifted open, and light bulbs burned out more quickly. The living room, usually the brightest space, began to take on a shadowy hue even during the day. I attempted to rationalize it, telling myself that the wiring was old and the fixtures needed replacing, but deep down, a gnawing dread warned me otherwise. I felt that whatever resided in the attic was gradually seeping into the rest of the house, casting a shadow over every corner and lurking behind every door. Even the mirrors became suspect. Whenever I caught my reflection, I noticed my eyes appeared bloodshot. Despite the fatigue that plagued my nights, there was a peculiar glimmer in my eyes, as if a stranger peered at me through a window, scrutinizing from within. In an effort to reclaim some semblance of control, I sought assistance, albeit indirectly. A colleague, who had some knowledge of old homes, mentioned that attics could occasionally develop pockets of cold air or strange acoustic phenomena. Yet, as I recounted my experiences, I found myself leaving out the more disturbing aspects. I couldn't bring myself to speak of the footprints that abruptly ended or the ladder that snapped shut on its own, fearing I would come across as irrational. My colleague suggested that perhaps I was dealing with pests or decaying wood that created the illusion of footsteps. I feigned agreement, but the moment I hung up the phone, the house seemed to release a long-held breath, as if it had been waiting for me to lower my defenses. A faint, rhythmic pounding began above, and my mouth went dry as a chill crept through my arms and settled heavily in my chest. Over time, these sensations intensified. I felt unseen eyes watching me in every room, especially in the narrow hallway leading to the attic. The atmosphere weighed on me like oppressive humidity, making each breath a struggle. My anxiety escalated, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Any subtle noise, pipes clanking, floorboards creaking, triggered a surge of panic. The most disconcerting aspect was the feeling that my grasp on reality was slipping. I began to question whether the footsteps were genuine or mere figments of my weary imagination. Yet, each time I gathered enough doubt to dismiss the phenomenon as paranoia, the unsettling presence seemed all too real. Noisy thumps or creaks above my head would jolt me into a fresh surge of terror. The lack of sleep began to chip away at my judgment, and I started to fear I was on the verge of a breakdown. One night, unable to endure it any longer, I resolved to face the attic once more. I vowed not to be a captive in my own house. I donned a thick jacket, switched on every light in the hallway, and summoned enough courage to open the hatch. The ladder descended with a groan, almost as if issuing a warning. My heart pounded, and sweat slicked my palms. I forced my feet onto the rungs. The attic enveloped me in darkness as soon as my head cleared the entry. This time, I brought a more powerful flashlight and a heavy metal rod, serving more as a psychological comfort than an actual weapon. I steeled myself, shining the light in all directions, determined to uncover a raccoon, a squirrel, anything to explain those footsteps. The silence in that space was suffocating. My breath echoed, and my pulse drummed in my ears. I spotted the same trail of footprints as before, however, now there were more prints branching out like some cryptic pattern in the dust. My chest tightened with fear so intense it felt almost tangible. The footprints zigzagged and swirled, then ended abruptly in the middle of the floor. I followed them, stepping as quietly as I could. At one point, I noticed a cluster of them surrounding a small square of floorboards that appeared slightly elevated. I crouched down. As I shone my flashlight, an unusual sense of static electricity tingled across my skin, causing my breath to catch in my throat. I experienced the strangest feeling that touching that elevated plank would unleash something beyond my control. My body trembled with the fear of an unexplainable presence so near. It was then that I heard it, a raspy intake of breath, alarmingly close to my ear. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I spun around, raising the beam of my flashlight to cut through the darkness. Although there was no one in sight, I sensed an oppressive mass lurking in the shadows. Panic gripped me, and my vision blurred as I stumbled backward, sending dust scattering in all directions. The next sound was a sharp click, reminiscent of a trigger being pulled. Before I could react, the ladder jolted upwards. In a heartbeat, I hurled myself toward the opening, wedging the rod into the gap. The ladder slammed shut but was halted by the rod. With my heart racing, I crawled forward and pried the hatch open just enough to scramble through. The light in the corridor felt like a spotlight compared to the stifling attic. My limbs shook so violently that I could barely remain upright. Once I reached the hallway floor, I slammed the hatch shut with my shoulder and braced against it, as if expecting whatever was lurking above to force its way out. For a moment, nothing happened, but then the attic erupted with banging, heavy, furious thuds from inside the hatch. Each impact reverberated through the ceiling, rattling my teeth. My chest tightened, and I feared I would lose consciousness. I clung to the hatch latch with all my strength. The pounding abruptly ceased, leaving me enveloped in a trembling silence, interrupted only by my labored breaths. Eventually, the corridor's light flickered before stabilizing, and the quiet returned, more terrifying than the noise. It felt as if the entire house was eavesdropping, aware of my every thought. That night, I couldn't endure staying any longer. I hastily packed a bag, rushing from room to room, always sensing those invisible eyes drilling into my back. The echo of footsteps in the attic pulsed in my mind, even though I could no longer hear them. I left the house and ended up sleeping in my car, parked a few blocks away, wherever I could find a spot under a bright street light. Despite the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still observing me. My thoughts were consumed by that elusive presence and the oppressive darkness of the attic. At dawn, I contemplated calling someone to help investigate, but the fear of ridicule and disbelief held me back. Eventually, I resolved to confront it differently, by reclaiming my home without attempting to physically challenge whatever was there. So, I returned in the early morning, just as the first rays of sunlight crept over the roof. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The atmosphere still felt charged, but less hostile in the daylight. I lit every lamp, opened every window, and let fresh air pour in. My heart still raced, and I was certain I could feel a presence behind me each time I moved from room to room, but I refused to let it paralyze me. Instead of returning to the attic, I stood beneath the hatch and spoke with determination, more to reassure myself than anything else, asserting that this was my home. In a trembling voice, I declared that I would not be driven away. The only immediate response was the faint rattling of the hatch door, as if it were testing my determination. I have remained here since, though my nights are still plagued by restlessness. The footsteps continue, especially during the late hours when the wind is calm and I am most susceptible to my fears. Occasionally, the house feels almost normal, but then a sudden chill will rush down my spine, and I know I am being watched once more. The corridor remains the most unsettling part. Passing beneath the attic hatch triggers a deep, primal fear within me. Yet, I persist in living here. I have installed new locks, added brighter lights, and attempted every logical approach to maintain my sanity. Although the house no longer slams the ladder shut on me, I still hear that slow, deliberate pacing overhead each night. Sometimes, it's faint, a distant echo that could be mistaken for the wind, if only it didn't stop so precisely above wherever I stand. I have not found a neat solution or a clear explanation for what torments me. Part of me wonders if the house itself is alive, steeped in generations of secrets. Another part suspects some psychological fracture within my mind, a result of stress and solitude. Whatever the cause, the sensation of those unseen eyes never truly dissipates. If anything, it has become a constant reminder that reality can unravel at its edges, revealing glimpses of the unknown. Glimpses of a world we'd rather deny persist in my thoughts. I've come to terms with the fact that I might never definitively confirm or refute the presence of something in my attic. Yet, each time I ascend the stairs and stand in the corridor beneath that ominous hatch, I feel an unspoken confrontation looming. The air seems charged with tension, my heartbeat quickens, my breathing becomes shallow, and perspiration cools on my temples. In those moments, I sense I'm just inches away from another confrontation. For now, I continue living in an uneasy truce. Some nights, I manage a few hours of sleep without hearing a single footfall. Other nights, the footsteps are relentless, pulling me from slumber into a state of heart-pounding alertness. I realize that the greatest horror isn't the footsteps themselves, nor the potential presence of an entity above. It's the profound uncertainty, wondering when the next occurrence will take place, feeling the oppressive gaze in every mirror and corner, listening for noises in the attic when the house should be still. That constant anxiety coils in my gut, whispering that I'm never truly safe here, yet also that I cannot simply escape. Whether it's madness or the supernatural, it has become a part of my life now, ingrained like the dust on the attic floor. Each day, I brace myself for a final revelation that might never come, haunted by the understanding that the true terror lies in the anticipation of what hides behind locked doors and above silent ceilings, waiting to be acknowledged. I recall the first time my heart threatened to burst from my chest in that living room. It was a damp evening, the type that envelops the walls in a quiet, stifling humidity. My dog Toby, a gentle creature who typically welcomed strangers with an enthusiastic wag of his tail, stood rigid, his fur standing on end as he growled at the corner where an iron crucifix was displayed. A chill swept through my veins as I realized he wasn't barking at anything I could discern. There was no sound, no change in lighting, nothing visible or audible to my senses. Yet, Toby remained fixated, his teeth bared, his body tense in a manner I had never witnessed before. Something in that corner demanded his focus, and his reaction was anything but typical. The following morning, after a predominantly sleepless night, I tried to persuade myself it had been merely a random noise that startled him. Perhaps the pipes had clattered or a neighbor's footsteps had echoed through the floorboards. However, as I shuffled into the living room, barefoot and drowsy, I felt my breath hitch in my throat. The crucifix was no longer upright, it was bent backward, contorted in a manner that implied a force far exceeding that of mere gravity or an accidental nudge. I stared at it for several heartbeats, feeling a tingling sensation creep up my spine. Toby let out a soft whine from the doorway, refusing to set a single paw in that corner, even when I beckoned him closer and tossed treats in the direction of the area. He skirted around it, declining to approach the twisted crucifix. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The iron felt inexplicably cold, as though it had been stored in a freezer overnight. That day, a heavy weight lingered over me, an anxious knot in my stomach that refused to uncoil. Struggled to breathe in a living room that had once felt inviting but now seemed suffocating, as if enveloped by a dense, unseen fog. The sunlight filtering through the windows appeared dimmer, as though the curtains had been steeped in soot. Despite my best efforts, an unwavering feeling of being watched clung to me. Each time I passed by that particular corner, I imagined a flicker of movement from the periphery of my vision, just a fleeting shadow vanishing the instant I turned my head. My palms became clammy, and my heart pounded with a dull, persistent roar in my ears. I tried to maintain composure, keeping myself occupied with minor chores around the house. I vacuumed the carpets, arranged books on the shelves, and polished the kitchen counters until they shone. Yet, Toby's behavior only grew more peculiar. He lingered near the entrance to the living room, peering inside as if anticipating something to spring forth. Occasionally, he let out a muffled bark or a low whine, and each time my chest constricted as if an icy hand were squeezing my lungs. By late afternoon, my nerves were frayed. I was drained both mentally and physically from the stifling tension within my own home. That night, I settled into bed with the resolve to sleep, but around 2 a.m., a noise startled me awake, the unmistakable rumble of a growl. I sat up abruptly, blinking away the remnants of sleep. Toby lay beside me, fully awake, ears erect, his lips drawn back in a silent snarl. The sound that had roused me was not of his making. I heard it again, a raspy, guttural growl resonating from the hallway. My heart thudded so violently that I feared I might be sick. With trembling fingers, I reached for the lamp switch, and as the bulb burst to life, the growling ceased. Toby remained vigilant, yet the noise dissolved into the house's silence. An acrid taste filled my mouth, and I felt dizzy, as if the air had thinned, leaving me lightheaded. Struggling to maintain a semblance of normalcy, I went through my daily routine. I brewed coffee, gazed out the window at the dreary sky, and tried to breathe through the all-consuming dread that loomed like a storm cloud overhead. My mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps it had been a stray animal outside, the wind shaking a loose shutter, or merely a half-remembered dream conjured by my anxious mind. However, Toby's constant unease dispelled all those rationalizations. His behavior had never been this way before. He refused to enter the living room entirely, choosing instead to linger in the hallway as if protecting me from something within those walls. I made several phone calls to friends, describing my dog's distress in vague terms. Most suggested I take him to a veterinarian or perhaps consider consulting an animal behaviorist. I couldn't bring myself to mention the twisted crucifix or the eerie nighttime growl. Part of me worried about how they would react. I didn't want to seem unhinged. Another part of me dreaded hearing the logical explanation they might provide because deep down, I suspected something far beyond logic was occurring. As dusk approached once more, I felt the tension in my chest coiled tighter. The setting sun painted the sky in garish shades. Hues of orange and red hues seeped through my windows, bathing the living room in a sickly glow. The corner holding the crucifix seemed to deepen, as if the shadows had thickened into a tangible presence. My breathing became shallow, and I forced myself to turn on every lamp and overhead light in the house. Toby remained glued to my heel, his tail tucked nervously between his legs. Around 11 p.m., an overwhelming sense of dread enveloped me. I couldn't concentrate on anything. My vision blurred at the edges, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like distant drums echoing through a cave. My pulse quickened, and a cold sweat clung to my temples. Images of the twisted crucifix kept flashing in my mind, and each time, my stomach lurched. I found myself pacing back and forth, checking the locks on my doors, then rechecking them until I lost count. Toby paced alongside me, occasionally pausing to let out a trembling whimper. When midnight arrived, I felt compelled to confront the corner directly. Perhaps it was a moment of desperation. I wanted to prove to myself that nothing was there. So, I marched into the living room, ignoring the fact that Toby stopped at the doorway and refused to follow. The air felt heavier the closer I got to the crucifix, as if I were wading through water. My skin prickled, and a faint metallic taste coated my tongue. The crucifix lay exactly where I had placed it after finding it bent. It should have been comforting to see it untouched, yet I felt no relief. A sudden gust of frigid air grazed the nape of my neck, causing goosebumps to erupt across my arms. The overhead light flickered, plunging the room into intermittent darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart pounded fiercely against my rib cage. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was merely a power surge or an electrical glitch. However, deep inside, every nerve in my body screamed that it was something different, something far more menacing. Sleep completely evaded me that night. Around 3 a.m., I heard the growl again, but this time it was closer, echoing through the hallway as if something was standing just a few feet from my bedroom door. Toby leapt up, barking, but the noise that followed was not a typical bark. It was deeper, harsher, almost wet-sounding, as though the lungs producing it were damaged or not human. My entire body quivered with sheer terror. I remained in bed, paralyzed, while Toby seemed torn between the instinct to protect me and the urge to flee. Eventually, the growling faded into silence, leaving me drenched in sweat and my heart pounding so violently that I could scarcely breathe. A question embedded itself in my mind, refusing to release its grip. Was I losing my sanity? Could this all be some warped hallucination, a byproduct of stress, insomnia, or an overactive imagination? The following morning, I discovered the crucifix had been moved again. This time, it was not only twisted but also positioned upside down on the ground, as if deliberately placed there. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the sticky gloss of sweat. My palm was sweaty as my stomach churned with unease. I couldn't comprehend such power or precision. It seemed as if some entity had effortlessly gripped the iron and twisted it back. Toby barked from behind me, and though he expressed his alarm, he refused to come any closer. I considered reaching out for help, perhaps consulting a spiritual advisor or at least someone with a strong constitution for the inexplicable. Yet, as the day progressed, I couldn't bring myself to do it. My pride insisted I manage it on my own, while my fear of being branded as insane kept my phone untouched on the kitchen counter. I kept myself occupied by rearranging furniture, hoping to dispel whatever negative energy might be lingering in that corner. However, each time I moved something, a wave of nausea washed over me, as if I were disturbing a presence that wanted everything to stay exactly as it was. Night descended once more, bringing with it an oppressive gloom that seeped into my very bones. Every corner of the house seemed charged with unseen tension. The flickering bulbs, the faint creaks, and Toby's relentless pacing wore on my nerves until I felt I might break. By 2 a.m., the house had become a prison of darkness, and a stifling sense of dread pressed heavily on my chest. I was too alert to sleep, yet too exhausted to think clearly. It was then that I heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. They were neither frantic nor rushed, just a slow, deliberate approach. My skin crawled, and my heart pounded so violently that my vision throbbed with each beat. Toby let out a strangled yelp and sought refuge beneath the bed. I could hear the sound of his claws scraping against the floor as he struggled to distance himself even further from the door. My mouth went dry, and I clung to the blankets with every muscle tense, my breath coming in ragged gasps as if I had just finished a marathon. The footsteps halted outside my bedroom door, and silence coiled in the air like a viper poised to strike. Then came a low, guttural growl, the same eerie sound that had haunted my nights. A rush of adrenaline surged through me, leaving me lightheaded and on the brink of losing consciousness. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling so violently that I nearly collapsed. Each step toward the door felt like traversing an insurmountable distance, and my mind screamed at me to stop, to barricade myself, to do anything but open that door. Yet, a grim determination propelled me forward. I wanted this ordeal to end. When I finally yanked open the door, the hallway lay empty. No sign of movement, no footprints, no lingering figure. Only the overhead light flickering with a soft buzz. My muscles turned to jelly, and I leaned against the doorframe, gasping for air. Toby poked his head out from under the bed, whining softly. In that moment, I couldn't tell who was more terrified, him or me. I resolved that if I was going to spend another night in that house, I needed to confront the corner in the living room, to do something symbolic, perhaps to break whatever hold it had on both me and Toby. With trembling resolve, I gathered a small bowl of water, the only semblance of a cleansing ritual I could devise on such short notice. The air felt oppressively heavy as I approached that cursed spot, every hair on my body stood on end, and a cold sweat trickled down my back. The crucifix lay there, still inverted, mocking my attempts at maintaining normalcy. With trembling hands, I picked it up, feeling a shock of cold travel from my fingertips to my wrist, as if I had plunged my hand into a bucket of ice water. My stomach churned, yet I forced myself to hold it upright. Then, in a quavering whisper, I muttered a plea for peace under my breath, words that I wasn't even sure formed any coherent sentence. The crucifix felt heavier than it should have, as though something unseen weighed it down or resisted as I placed it back on the wall. Toby began barking from the other side of the room, his barks frantic and sharp, akin to a warning. Out of the corner of my eye, the room's edges seemed to ripple, as if heat waves were distorting the air. The overhead light flickered erratically, plunging the room into staccato bursts of darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and breathing became a struggle. The wave of cold intensified, seeping into my very bones. But then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the flickering ceased. And the air grew still. Toby's barking softened into frightened whimpers. I found myself panting, drenched in sweat, my legs on the verge of collapsing. I scanned the room, half expecting some dreadful shape to reveal itself, yet everything remained painfully normal. The furniture stood exactly where I had placed it, the walls silent, and the crucifix now hung upright, albeit slightly askew. My entire body quivered in the aftermath of the tension. For several minutes, I stood there, unable to fully articulate the sensations coursing through me. I focused on forcing air in and out of my lungs, attempting to calm my racing pulse. Toby cautiously approached, pressing his body against my leg, offering a semblance of comfort. Together, we stared at the crucifix, and though the corner still retained a vague sense of oppression, it no longer thrummed with that malevolent energy. It dawned on me that perhaps the force tormenting us was feeding on our fear and uncertainty. By confronting it and refusing to hide, we might have disrupted its hold. Yet, even with this realization, I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that the house had changed. It was as though a new layer of darkness had settled in, waiting. Part of me felt victorious for having stood my ground, while another part remained deeply unsettled, convinced that this confrontation might only be the beginning of something I wasn't equipped to comprehend. In the days that followed, Toby began inching closer to the living room corner. He'd sniff around, ears perked, tail lowered but not completely tucked. I noticed the oppressive atmosphere wasn't as thick, allowing me to move through the house without my heart racing every time I passed a doorway. However, nighttime still held lingering echoes of the unknown. Occasionally, I would wake to the faintest growl in the corridor, though it seemed distant, as if emanating from a place only partially in this world. I can't say I ever fully felt at ease again. The twisted crucifix, now reshaped to the best of my ability, serves as an ever-present reminder that something inexplicable once took hold in my home. Each time my dog hesitates at the living room's threshold, I'm reminded of how the line between normalcy and horror can be alarmingly thin. Even now, I occasionally catch a fleeting movement or hear a distant, low rumble in the dead of night. My heart races each time, fear licking at the edges of my thoughts like a slow-burning flame. I remain in the house because I refuse to flee. I tell myself that by living here, by confronting that corner every day, I'm resisting the darkness. Whether this is true or merely a tale I tell myself to maintain my sanity, I may never know. What I do know is that the iron crucifix remains on my wall, slightly askew, a silent testament to whatever confrontation occurred in my living room. Whenever I sense that creeping dread, I feel the echo of that unimaginable cold against my skin, the flickering lights and the deep, otherworldly growl. It hasn't truly departed, and I'm not certain it ever will. Yet in some twisted way, I've learned to endure it, living each day in a fragile balance with whatever lurks just beyond human perception. I recall the very first moment I felt that chill in my chest, as if an invisible hand had slipped through my rib cage and clutched my heart. It transpired in the darkest hours of an unfamiliar night, inside a guest room that felt more like a sealed crypt than a place of rest. Even now, recalling that single suffocating moment, the unsettling moment sent my heart into a rapid beat, a vivid reminder that some experiences elude rational explanation. The memory clung to me like a shadow, hovering just above my face, oppressive and clammy, reminiscent of the stale air in a long-forgotten cellar. It was a night that irreversibly altered my understanding of silence and darkness. I was staying at my friend's house for a brief visit. He had cautioned me in a light-hearted, half-joking manner that the guest room was seldom used and might be a tad musty. He never mentioned anything about peculiar sounds or inexplicable occurrences, only that I might require extra blankets, as the old radiator had a tendency to stop working in the middle of the night. The day had been quite ordinary: coffee in the morning, a quick drive around the neighborhood, and a lengthy conversation in his living room while we sipped tea. We were merely catching up, discussing life's changes and recent job frustrations. There was nothing unusual. I had no reason to suspect that his house harbored any hidden mysteries or lurking presences. Yet, an inexplicable feeling tugged at me the instant I entered that guest room. The air seemed denser, as if gravity had shifted just beyond the threshold. The walls bore an off-white hue, but in the dim overhead light, they appeared a pale gray. A small lamp on the nightstand cast a faint, yellowish glow. The bed was old-fashioned, and the mattress creaked as I sat down. The first subtle warning came in the form of a faint buzzing in my ears. Initially, I dismissed it as mere imagination or a lingering effect of something else. The background, harmonizing with the stillness, yet my fingertips traced the floral patterned wallpaper, revealing a subtle undercurrent of static tension, as if the room was softly humming a melody only it could discern. My friend knocked at the door, seeking to ensure my comfort. I assured him that all was well, though a slight unease caused my voice to waver. He mentioned something like, "Don't worry about any peculiar sounds. This place tends to creak at night." With that, he departed, leaving me alone with the dancing shadows. I could have followed him to express the strange sensation in my chest, but it seemed irrational. I chose to dismiss it, attributing it perhaps to nerves or the usual discomfort of staying in someone else's home. As I readied myself for bed, my eyes kept flitting to the room's corners. The overhead light had a faint flicker, as if on the brink of burning out. Each corner appeared unusually dark, a darkness that seemed to have a texture, as though it swirled in place. I tried to dismiss it, reasoning that the mind often conjures shapes in peripheral vision, especially when fatigued. So, I switched off the main light and turned on the bedside lamp, hoping its softer glow might soothe me to sleep. I slipped beneath the covers, noting the chill of the sheets despite the late summer warmth. The mattress springs creaked, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard an echo of that sound in the room's corner. Moments later, everything fell silent, as if the house itself had paused to listen. My heartbeat pulsed in the background, synchronizing with the stillness. The whisper of doubt echoed in my mind, but I reassured myself that I was merely overreacting. I concentrated on my breathing, taking long, deep breaths to calm my jittery nerves. Gradually, my eyelids became heavy, and the tangled web of half-formed anxieties dissolved into a dreamless sleep. In the early hours before dawn, I was jolted awake. The oppressive darkness was suffocating. My bedside lamp had extinguished, and the radiator was frigid. The air carried a slight dampness, reminiscent of a musty basement. That's when I sensed it, an intimidating presence looming over me, as though it was searching for something just beneath my skin. My eyes struggled to adjust, but all I could perceive was a void of blackness, shifting like tendrils of smoke. My heart raced, and my tongue felt parched and useless within my mouth. Initially, I couldn't muster the courage to move. Then, my ears caught a low, almost guttural sound near my left ear, a reverberation that seemed to vibrate along my jawbone. Goosebumps spread across my arms, and cold sweat gathered at the nape of my neck. Each labored breath made my chest feel more constricted, as though the atmosphere had thickened. The presence was near. I almost believed I could feel it exhaling against my cheek. Every instinct screamed at me to turn on the light, to dispel whatever was transpiring, yet I felt paralyzed, pinned down by the intensity of the moment. It was a primal terror that defied logical explanation, akin to a cornered animal sensing an imminent, unseen predator. Finally, desperation surged within me, and I lunged for the bedside. The lamp wobbled in my grasp as I struggled to flip the switch, and when the light finally flickered on, it was dim but mercifully stable. My eyes scanned the room urgently. There was nothing there, no shadow, no presence, just the old dresser, the uninspired wallpaper, and the door securely closed. Yet, something was undeniably amiss. The comforter beside me bore a distinct indentation, a clear sign of weight, as if someone heavy had just been kneeling there moments before. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I pressed down on the sunken area. It was icy to the touch, reminiscent of a patch of snow in an otherwise temperate landscape. That was when my breathing became shallow, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The rational part of my mind insisted it was merely a quirk of the fabric, or perhaps I had unknowingly pressed down on that spot in my sleep. However, the raw, immediate fear in my gut screamed that something else had shared the bed with me, something unseen yet intensely perceived on a visceral level. Unable to return to sleep, I stayed awake, hugging my knees and keeping the lamp on until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the thin curtains. Occasionally, I thought I heard a faint creak or a subtle shifting sound in the room, like the floorboards adjusting under a slow, deliberate weight. But whenever I looked, there was nothing. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy doze just as the sun rose high enough to brighten the walls. My body felt utterly drained, as if I had been running a marathon or fighting off a fever. Later that morning, I emerged from the guest room feeling haggard. My friend immediately noticed my pallor and inquired if I was feeling okay. I calmly explained that I had endured a particularly difficult night and had likely experienced the most bizarre episode of sleep paralysis in my life. He gave me a concerned expression, mentioning that another guest who had stayed in the same room had also reported disturbing dreams. He didn't provide further details, but it was clear that discussing it made him uncomfortable. The conversation offered no solace. Instead, it intensified my feeling of being trapped in something beyond my comprehension. Throughout the day, I attempted to alleviate the tension by remaining in brightly lit areas. My friend and I strolled around the yard, observing the slightly overgrown grass and the gnarled branches of an ancient oak tree that loomed over a section of the house. The wind rustled through the leaves, creating an eerie whisper. Even outside, I couldn't completely shake the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. My limbs felt rigid, and a dull ache settled behind my eyes. Twice, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A dark shape darting behind the garage, a shifting shadow near the fence. But when I turned to look directly, nothing was there. We went back inside for lunch, and despite the house being filled with sunlight, it seemed strangely somber. The corridors appeared narrower, and the corners seemed darker. I tried to convince myself that my edginess was simply due to my sleepless night. After all, when our minds are clouded by exhaustion, we often perceive what we fear. Yet, an inexplicable heaviness settled over me. Knot in my stomach tightened whenever I ventured near the guest room door. I could almost taste the anxiety in my throat, a metallic tang blended with the dryness of fear. My friend suggested I stay another night, offering me the living room couch if I felt uneasy about the guest room. I declined, insisting that I would be fine and that I planned to confront my irrational fears directly. Yet, as evening crept in, a quiet dread settled into my bones. The golden rays of the setting sun cast elongated shadows along the walls, and I noticed how those shadows seemed to crawl, inching through the house with a predatory slowness. My heart skipped a beat whenever I recalled the sound I had heard close to my ear, a low, throaty rasp that hinted at something inhuman. Later, when my friend retired to his bedroom, I lingered in the hallway, uncertain about returning to the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the dim interior. The overhead light was off, and the silhouette of the dresser against the far wall appeared distorted, as if something had bent it in the half-light. My chest tightened, and my feet felt glued to the floor as an irrational part of me wanted to flee outside and spend the night in my car. However, I compelled myself to step inside. The air felt colder than before, with a subtle dampness clinging to the walls. I turned on the bedside lamp immediately, leaving the overhead light off, and the corners remained deeply shadowed, giving me the unsettling sense that the room was watching. The shadows seemed deeper than they ought to be, as if the room's geometry had somehow shifted. As I gently closed the door, a faint draft grazed my neck, causing me to shiver as I recalled the unsettling sensation of being breathed upon. Striving to maintain my composure, I placed my phone on the nightstand, its flashlight function poised for use, just in case. The hours slipped by without any significant disturbances, yet I remained unable to relax enough to drift into a restful slumber. My heart continued to race, beating faster than usual, and my skin felt sticky with nervous perspiration. Occasionally, the radiator would emit a clanking noise, sending hollow echoes through the room that heightened my anxiety. I rolled over, burying my face in the pillow in an attempt to shut out the oppressive atmosphere. Just as I began to succumb to drowsiness, a faint scraping noise emanated from the far corner, reminiscent of someone lightly dragging their nails across the wall. My stomach lurched, and a cold sweat formed on my forehead. Mustering courage, I activated my phone's flashlight and directed its beam toward the corner. The light revealed only the plain wallpaper and a small wooden chair. Yet, as I was about to look away, I glimpsed a flicker, a shapeless darkness, a distortion in the air that seemed to retract into itself. My breath caught, and a tremor coursed through me like an electric shock. I couldn't be certain whether it was a shadow cast by something outside or merely a trick of my strained mind, but I felt as if I were being watched. I attempted to speak, to demand that whatever it was reveal itself, but my throat felt constricted. Instead, a raspy whisper escaped my lips, sounding more like a plea than a command. The atmosphere in the room felt increasingly charged with tension. The room seemed to press in on me, closing in with unseen hands. My vision momentarily blurred, and I felt a presence weaving through the shadowy corners, circling like a predator waiting for the opportune moment. The hair on my arms stood erect, and my teeth chattered softly, despite the warmth of the blankets enveloping me. Suddenly, the light on the nightstand flickered and extinguished, leaving my phone's flashlight as the sole source of illumination. My heart thudded so forcefully that I feared it might explode. I swung the beam of light around, seeking the cause of the sudden darkness, yet found no apparent explanation. The lamp remained plugged in, yet the bulb stubbornly refused to shine. At that moment, a deep, resonant hum filled the air, a guttural, vibrating tone that seemed to emanate from all directions, reverberating within my skull. Breathing became a struggle as the sound enveloped me, setting my teeth on edge and rattling my bones. In a desperate bid, I scrambled out of bed and yanked the door open, stumbling into the hallway. The house was shrouded in darkness, and the corridor light was out as well. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I battled the rising tide of panic. Clutching my phone, I navigated toward the living room, intending to flee, to walk out the front door and never look back. Yet, an irrational pull made me pause at the base of the stairs. I glanced back down the hallway toward the guest room. My flashlight revealed nothing but an empty, silent passage. No shape or form stood there, yet the persistent sensation of being watched crawled over my skin like tiny spiders, despite my overwhelming urge to escape. Overwhelmed by an impending sense of dread, I found myself re-entering the room one final time, determined to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. The air inside felt denser now, heavy with an indescribable energy. The bed remained as I had left it, with the sheets twisted and the lamp unlit, but on the mattress, there was a pronounced indentation, as if someone or something had been perched on its edge. A surge of terror shot through my spine, my eyes welled up, and my hands trembled, causing the flashlight beam to waver. No matter how desperately I searched for a rational explanation, my thoughts returned to that elusive presence I had sensed in the darkness. That was enough for me. Clutching my phone, I retreated, never turning my back to the room until I reached the doorway. I resolved then and there to spend the rest of the night in the living room, fully clothed and with the lights on, my heart still pounding. I waited out the hours, the hum of the refrigerator in the nearby kitchen serving as a tether to reality. Occasionally, I imagined that low growl in my ear again or caught fleeting glimpses of swirling shadows just beyond my field of vision. I rubbed my eyes, questioning my sanity and wondering if exhaustion had caused me to hallucinate. But the impressions on the bed and the cold spot on the comforter felt disturbingly real. Eventually, dawn arrived, its pale light filtering through the blinds. My friend found me slumped on the couch, my eyes bloodshot, and asked if I had been awake all night. I nodded, too exhausted to offer a coherent explanation, and mumbled something incomprehensible about peculiar happenings, such as the swirling shadows and an undeniable physical presence near me. He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his expression full of concern. He assured me that he understood and wouldn't insist on details if I preferred to keep them to myself. His tone suggested that he believed me, or at the very least, he believed that I genuinely experienced what I claimed. I departed that morning, driving off with the windows down to let the brisk air lash against my face, keeping me alert. As I glanced at the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but imagine that smoky darkness clinging to the trunk or swirling in the backseat, lying in wait for nightfall to emerge once more. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to concentrate on the road and ignore the unsettling sensation that I had narrowly escaped. Even now, safe within my own home, I occasionally awaken in the dead of night, convinced I hear that same low, resonant growl. My skin tingles with the memory of that haunting presence. In my mind's eye, I envision the imprint on the comforter, the swirling shadows in the corners, and the silent weight that pressed so close to me. Although I try to dismiss it, attributing it to stress, exhaustion, or an overactive imagination, there are nights when I am certain the darkness in my bedroom seems to shift, as though it too is quietly alive. In those moments, I wonder if the entity I encountered truly remained behind in that old guest room, or if it followed me, patiently waiting for the darkness to descend once again. The night air felt unnerving. The air was unnaturally dense, as if it clung to my skin in layers of oppressive darkness. The garden behind my colleague's house was intended to be a serene retreat, with rows of shrubs, a modest fence, and a few lanterns casting a gentle glow. Yet, from the moment I set foot on the grass, I sensed an underlying tension, an ominous feeling that unsettled me. My heart pounded in my ears, and each breath I released seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness. It was during this unsettling moment, under the shifting moonlight, that I noticed an obscure shape hidden within the foliage. A small wooden door that appeared ancient, warped, and strangely out of place. That discovery marked the beginning of my journey into what I can only describe as an unraveling of reality. I remember squinting at the door, puzzled as to how I had never noticed it before. It seemed embedded in the fence, yet the surrounding boards were warped in such a manner that the door appeared even older, like a centuries-old piece of driftwood wedged among newer planks. My gut twisted with a peculiar blend of curiosity and apprehension. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it a faint scent of something burnt, reminiscent of old incense lingering in a temple for decades. My breathing became shallow, and my skin turned cold. I reached out to touch the handle, half expecting the door to be sealed shut with rust. To my surprise, the latch yielded with a dull clunk, and the door creaked open into complete darkness. I hesitated, leaning forward to catch a glimpse of what lay beyond. A corridor stretched out from the threshold, illuminated at its distant end by a weak, flickering light that cast a warm glow on. To glance over my shoulder, my heart pounding with such intensity that it seemed to echo down the corridor. The walls of the passage were oppressive, and the air that leaked out was musty and suffocating, infused with the same sharp scent of incense that lingered on my tongue like decayed spice. An immediate sense of foreboding gripped my chest as I caught the faintest hint of whispers, almost inaudible, like distant chanting muted by the thick walls. My pulse throbbed against my ribs, and despite every instinct urging me to turn back, I felt an inexplicable need to press on. Perhaps it was a misplaced sense of courage or sheer recklessness, but I continued forward until I was enveloped by the darkness within. My footsteps resonated on the stone floor as the corridor narrowed, just wide enough for me to stretch my arms and graze the damp walls with my trembling fingers. Tiny rivulets of moisture trickled down the stones, slick with condensation. Each step brought me nearer to the flickering light, closer to the origin of those maddening whispers. I could have sworn unseen eyes were watching me from the shadowy corners of the passageway, and my heart raced faster with every step I took. Then, as if in a waking dream, I arrived at what seemed to be an alcove. The chanting became more distinct, though the words remained unintelligible, the rhythm churning my stomach. I halted, trying to calm my breath, acutely aware of the sweat pooling in my palms, threatening my grip on the door's rusted iron handle. A sudden noise behind me, a scraping on the floor, made my entire body jump, my vision momentarily blurred, and the periphery of my sight darkened. I turned to look back. I spun around so suddenly that a dizzying sensation nearly sent me sprawling. The corridor behind stretched into darkness, yet I could just make out the faint outline of the open door. The chanting seemed to emanate from all directions, and a wave of nausea surged through my stomach. An indescribable panic began to swell within me, as if something was about to emerge from the shadowy alcove. In a burst of desperate bravery, I seized the iron lock mechanism, now slippery in my sweaty grip, and tore it from the door. The metal screeched against the wood, sending an ear-piercing shriek. Through the corridor, my flight instinct kicked in, and I pivoted, stumbling over the uneven stones as I raced toward the exit with every ounce of energy I could muster. My lungs felt as though they might explode, and the corridor walls seemed to close in on me, as if attempting to ensnare me. I slipped through the threshold, the cool night air rushing over my clammy skin, and nearly collapsed onto the grass outside. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, my skin tingling with adrenaline. For a brief moment, I could still hear the echoes of chanting drifting from the corridor, the voices mingling with the night wind. It was then that I shouted for my colleague, my voice cracking with unrestrained fear. He was inside the house, likely in the kitchen or living room. I staggered to the back door, clutching the iron lock as if it were a lifeline. My heart pounded so violently that I felt faint. When my colleague joined me, I tried to convey what had transpired, my words tumbling out in a flurry. The frantic, disorganized rush painted a vivid picture of the old wooden door, the corridor, the scent of incense, and the haunting chants. He listened intently, his expression perplexed, with his brow furrowing deeper with each sentence. According to him, there had never been a door along that fence, not even a small gate. Trying to stay composed, he agreed to accompany me out to the garden to see for himself. As we moved through the yard, a chill crept over my skin. The same patch of foliage rustled gently in the breeze. I pointed to the exact spot where I had discovered the door just moments earlier, but now there was nothing, no warped planks, no rusted handle, and no indication that a door had ever been there. The fence was seamless, a continuous stretch of wooden boards that appeared completely untouched. For a moment, I was convinced I had experienced some kind of waking nightmare. But then I looked down at my hand. I was still holding the iron lock, its metal weathered and tinged with rust, serving as evidence that I hadn't imagined the entire ordeal. My colleague's eyes widened in disbelief when I placed the lock in his hand. The weight of it seemed to confirm that something impossible had just taken place. The following day, I found it nearly impossible to concentrate on anything else. My colleague attempted to reassure me, suggesting that perhaps it was an old piece of hardware I had stumbled upon in the garden, but even he seemed doubtful. Each time I replayed the corridor in my mind, my pulse quickened, and a dry thickness spread across my tongue. I kept telling myself it was merely some bizarre trick of perception, perhaps exhaustion. The dim moonlight had conjured illusions, yet the sensation had been undeniably real, and the chanting had made my skin crawl. I kept scrutinizing the iron lock, noting its intricate patterns, as if it once belonged to something ancient and far more mysterious than a mere garden gate. In the days that followed, I revisited the fence repeatedly, searching for any clue that might validate my experience. Each visit left me in a heightened state of anxiety. I would stand in the garden, meticulously scanning every inch of the fence, touching the wooden boards, hoping to discover a hidden seam. Though I never found it, there were several occasions when I caught the faintest scent of stale incense, which made my stomach churn. A creeping paranoia seeped into my daily life. My head felt perpetually heavy, and I jumped at the slightest sounds. A cupboard closing, a door creaking in another room. My nights were restless, plagued by fragmented dreams of winding corridors and flickering lights. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. One afternoon, the tension in my chest became so overwhelming that I decided to confront it directly. In a halting voice, I told my colleague that I needed to explore that area of the garden more thoroughly. He seemed cautious but agreed, likely sensing I was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. I felt no small measure of guilt for involving him, yet I couldn't bear the thought of returning to that spot alone. Together, we combed through the bushes and shrubs, rummaging with determination. As we navigated through fallen leaves and damp soil, my colleague quietly expressed his unease, noting that he had never known the fence to possess any sort of hidden entrance. He also voiced his concern about how much this was consuming me. I remember offering a strained laugh, assuring him that I merely needed closure. As we pushed aside layers of foliage, I dropped to my hands and knees, pressing my ear against the fence boards. My breath resonated loudly in my head, and my heart pounded so intensely it nearly drowned out the soft ambient sounds of the yard. I listened intently, desperately hoping to detect anything that might hint at the corridor's existence. Initially, there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves. Then, faintly, I caught a whisper. It could have been the wind or perhaps my frayed nerves playing tricks on me, but it bore an eerily similar rhythm to the chant I had heard within that dreaded passage. I recoiled, my throat tight, scanning the fence for any sign of a door or gap, but all I saw was an unbroken line of wood. That night, sleep eluded me. Whenever I closed my eyes, I envisioned the corridor's walls, dripping with condensation and closing in around me. The chant echoed persistently in my mind, and my entire body broke out in a sweat. I felt a pressure behind my eyes as though I was on the brink of an irreversible breakdown. I forced myself out of bed, turning on every light in my apartment. My breathing was so erratic that my sides ached. In the fluorescent glow of the kitchen, I caught sight of myself reflected in a window, my face looking. My skin appeared hollow and sallow, as if I were being drained by my own obsession. Clenching my fists, I attempted to remind myself that I still possessed the iron lock as proof. Somehow, that tangible object was both a solace and a burden, a constant reminder that I wasn't merely losing my mind but was also tethered to a reality that should not exist. Over the subsequent days, I began to notice subtle yet disconcerting changes in my surroundings. The house felt colder than usual, even with the heater running. Electrical appliances flickered, their hum distorted in a manner that made my ears ring. The aroma of old incense appeared unexpectedly, drifting through hallways and rooms like a ghostly presence. Occasionally, at the edge of my vision, I would catch a fleeting glimpse of an impossibly tall figure with elongated limbs skirting just out of sight. My hair stood on end whenever this occurred. I tried to dismiss these sightings as stress-induced hallucinations, but they became more frequent. My colleague grew increasingly concerned and insisted that we discuss it. He suggested that I take a break, perhaps even consult a professional, but I couldn't endure the thought. Part of me believed that formally acknowledging it would make it all the more real. One evening, I resolved to confront the fence alone under the cover of darkness. Armed with a flashlight, I trudged through the garden's damp grass, my breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. The beam of the flashlight wavered because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I half expected to see the wooden door reappear. Instead of encountering anything unusual, I found myself facing a typical fence, its planks as ordinary and unremarkable as any suburban boundary. A wave of frustration and dread washed over me as I pressed my palm against the fence, feeling the familiar texture of the wood. Just as I began to turn away, a peculiar warmth spread through my hand. I looked down in panic, convinced the fence felt hot to the touch. Then, in a startling flash, the flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I glimpsed the corridor, a fleeting image of its flickering lig. HT and damp stone walls. My heart lurched violently, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight as the vision disappeared as quickly as it had come. The fence stood smooth and unbroken once more, yet the thick, stale scent of incense lingered in the air, clinging to my nostrils and weighing heavily on my tongue. I raced back to the house, every hair on my body standing on end. Once inside, I sank to my knees, my pulse pounding in my ears. The corridor's brief reappearance confirmed that it wasn't merely a hallucination. I had seen something real, somehow anchored to that spot in the garden. The memory of the chanting still haunted me, those unintelligible voices that seemed to call from just beyond the edge of reason. My entire body trembled, my muscles aching from the tension coiled within them. In the days that followed, I stopped visiting my colleague's house entirely. He tried to persuade me to return, insisting it would help me overcome the fear, but I refused. I couldn't risk another encounter with that impossible doorway. I focused instead on forgetting. I focused on the task of reacquainting myself with normalcy, though the corridor lingered in the recesses of my mind, persistently beckoning. Even within the confines of my apartment, the air occasionally carried that suffocating scent of incense. I found myself compulsively inspecting corners and closets for any hint of concealed openings. Nightmares became my routine, the metallic taste of fear lingering on my tongue each morning as I awoke. Ultimately, I resolved to encase the iron lock in a box and store it in my closet, hoping that relinquishing this tangible reminder might weaken the corridor's hold on my psyche. For several nights, things seemed marginally improved. My heartbeat settled into a more manageable rhythm, and I slept without visions of those dripping walls. However, on the final night of my ordeal, something unnerving occurred. I awoke in the pre-dawn hours, my room shrouded in darkness except for a faint glow from the street lamp outside. A soft scraping noise emanated from within my closet, reminiscent of metal sliding against wood. My entire body tensed, muscles rigid with terror, each breath feeling like a razor slicing through my throat. My mind conjured terrifying visions of that corridor bleeding through the closet door. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to suppress a scream. The scraping persisted for what seemed like an eternity, growing louder, then abruptly ceasing. I sat there, drenched in sweat, my fingers gripping the sheets. When dawn finally broke, I summoned the courage to open the closet. The box with the iron lock lay precisely where I had left it, but the lid was slightly ajar, twisting my insides with unease. The padlock sat in the box, but its position differed from how I had left it. I had no explanation, no reason to suspect anyone had tampered with it. I was alone in the apartment, yet the evidence lay right there, an undeniable indication that something was distorting my reality. It dawned on me then that my only chance to escape this nightmare was to confront the corridor on my own terms. Gripping the lock, I felt its cold metal resonate with my own tremors. I returned to my colleague's garden, with the setting sun casting elongated shadows across the grass. I placed the lock on the fence where the door had once stood. The air felt stifling, and my lungs struggled to draw breath. Closing my eyes, I silently demanded in my mind that it release me. I stood motionless for several minutes, heart pounding, skin clammy with sweat. Nothing happened, no door appeared, no chanting echoed through the yard. But as I opened my eyes, the smell of old incense swirled around me one last time before dissipating like a fading nightmare. From that day forward, the garden fence remained ordinary. My colleague whispered to me that he still occasionally noticed my distant stare whenever I visited. The corridor itself never reappeared. At least not visibly, yet I often sensed it lurking at the edge of my peripheral vision or in the hollow echo of a quiet room. The iron lock remains where I left it, rusting against the fence. A grim reminder that a door had indeed existed there, if only for a haunting moment. In that moment, even now, I'm uncertain whether I truly escaped or simply forged a fleeting agreement with forces beyond my understanding. The unsettling stillness of the garden at night hints that my ordeal might not be entirely concluded. Occasionally, in the dead silence of midnight, my body tenses with recollection, half expecting to hear that muted chanting once more, though it never materializes. Yet, the tension never truly dissipates. I carry the weight of that experience with me, acutely aware that reality can change in an instant. There are places that should not exist, thresholds better left untouched. Sometimes, I find myself standing on the back porch, staring at the fence bathed in moonlight, half convinced I can discern the outline of a door and smell the incense wafting across the yard. My heart races at the thought that one night I might rediscover that door, and that next time, I may not be able to turn back. On the night it happened, I recall standing on my narrow balcony, cigarette in hand, feeling the crisp air scrape my lungs. There was a hollow stillness all around, an unsettling calm that made the city lights seem more distant than usual. I took a slow drag, exhaling into the darkness, and that was when I saw it, a dense swirl of smoke that twisted and transformed into an unmistakable face. It was ancient and etched with lines, eyes hollow yet intent. There was a fleeting moment when that face seemed to fix its gaze on me, mouth poised to open. My lungs clenched, and my pulse pounded against my temples, mingling with the sickly sweet scent of extinguished candles. My senses were overwhelmed by something I had never linked with the scent of cigarette smoke. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the visage dissolved back into the darkness, yet the damage was done, my grasp on reality fractured in that instant. I tried to convince myself it must have been a trick of the light or a fleeting optical illusion. However, as I turned to head back inside, the reflection in the glass door trembled, as if someone else stood there, moving their head in a slow, deliberate arc. That sight made my stomach lurch. My own reflection shouldn't move on its own. My breath caught, and my chest tightened, as if the very air had become dense. I stood frozen, a thin film of sweat forming at the nape of my neck, half believing that if I blinked, something would emerge from behind the glass. When I finally forced myself to slide the door open, I sensed a presence behind me. Every hair on my body seemed to stand on end, and I nearly stumbled over the threshold, slamming the door shut as if something pursued me inside. The remainder of that night was an exercise in self-deception. I paced in my living room, my heart still jittery, attempting to rationalize what I had witnessed. I considered the flickering hallway bulb, the glare from streetlights, my own frayed nerves. Yet the memory replayed in my mind. that aged, smoky face and the scent of burnt wax. I stayed awake until dawn, finishing half a pack of cigarettes I had vowed to quit months ago. Whenever I sat still, I was overtaken by the sensation of an unseen gaze pressing upon me. My heart would race, and perspiration would form on my forehead, as though an unseen force were clutching my collar. The following morning, utterly drained and fueled by caffeine, I endeavored to put on a courageous facade. I had a lunch appointment with a friend, and although part of me was tempted to cancel, I compelled myself to go out. I felt more secure surrounded by people and the clamor of the world. During that lunch, I casually mentioned, more in jest than as a true admission, that I had witnessed something peculiar. On my balcony. My friend responded with a courteous laugh, suggesting perhaps I had consumed too much coffee or was simply overwhelmed with work. I nodded, allowing the conversation to meander onto other subjects, but I couldn't prevent my thoughts from drifting back to that eerie visage. My friend's reassurances only highlighted how surreal the event seemed to others. Upon returning to my apartment, the atmosphere felt amiss, as if the rooms were shrouded in darkness despite all the lights being on. The air was stagnant, as though it hadn't circulated in an eternity. There was a faint, sweet, smoky aroma in the living room, and I had the unsettling suspicion that it might be the same scent from the candle I had used previously. I moved around, turning on lamps and opening windows, attempting to restore a sense of normalcy to the space, but I couldn't shake the growing unease twisting in my stomach. My shoulders were tense from constant vigilance, and my breathing was shallow and rapid. The floors creaked at irregular intervals, as if someone else was shifting their weight in the adjacent room, even though I knew I was alone. That night, I paused before stepping onto the balcony. My yearning for a cigarette was eclipsed by the haunting memory of that face. Yet, I felt an inexplicable urge to confront the events that had transpired. I convinced myself that if I encountered something again, I could finally determine whether it was merely my imagination. With my heart pounding so fiercely that I could feel my pulse in my throat, I gently slid open the glass door. The frigid air struck me like a warning. I lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, each breath out forming a perfectly ordinary shifting cloud of grayish vapor that dissolved into the night. As a sense of relief began to trickle in, I started to believe that perhaps the previous night had been a singular hallucination. Then, I cast another glance at the glass door. My reflection was there, yet it appeared slightly misaligned, like an image on a skewed projector. My stomach somersaulted, and I blinked, hoping it was merely fatigue in my eyes. My reflection blinked back, but the movement wasn't perfectly synchronized. The hair on my neck bristled, and despite the chill, I was sweating. It felt as though the reflection was struggling to mirror my movements but lagged just a split second behind. In that instant, my fingers felt numb around the cigarette, and my lungs constricted as if I couldn't breathe properly. I gripped the railing, trying to steady myself, but a wave of vertigo hit me so intensely that I feared losing consciousness. I forced myself back inside, shutting the door firmly. My reflection disappeared from view as I drew the curtain closed, leaving me alone with the relentless pounding of my heart and the dull hum of anxiety. The dim illumination from my apartment's overhead light left me feeling unbalanced. Every sound, the clanking of pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, and the distant rumble of traffic, took on a sinister tone. It was as if my senses were heightened to an unbearably high level. My skin felt clammy, and my muscles ached from the constant tension. In the days that followed, this unsettling presence lingered even when I refrained from smoking entirely. My mental state gradually deteriorated. I would awaken at odd hours to the faint scraping of something against the walls or the subtle shift of a shadow beneath my door. Occasionally, when I entered the bathroom, the overhead light would flicker in a slow, rhythmic pattern. My reflection in the mirror appeared strangely elongated, as if gravity was pulling my features downward. I even began to perceive the eyes in the reflection focusing on me, as though another person were peering through a thin veil. One particularly unnerving afternoon, while washing dishes, I suddenly felt an invisible clamp around my chest, as if unseen arms were squeezing the air from my lungs. I dropped a plate into the sink, the clattering echoing through the kitchen. My vision blurred, and the scent of burnt candles assaulted my senses once again. I stood there, trembling, water running, heart pounding as if it were attempting to escape my rib cage. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to leave me gasping for breath. adrenaline coursing hot through my veins. I contemplated staying at a hotel or temporarily renting another place, but the thought of abandoning my apartment felt wrong. Tasks. My concentration wavered, and I found myself struggling to keep up with everyday responsibilities. Despite my efforts, the unease persisted, permeating every aspect of my life. I had never been fond of the idea of fleeing from my own sanctuary. Instead, I opted to resist in subtle ways. I ignited sage bundles, scattered salt near the windows, and left the lights on continuously, hoping to dispel whatever energy seemed to cling to the shadows. I even explored ancient superstitions, learning about how mirrors might ensnare spirits or how certain incenses could fend off malevolent forces. Each attempt offered only fleeting comfort. The oppressive sensation would return within hours, like a suffocating blanket draped over me, leaving a clammy dread on my skin. As the weeks went by, my dreams became increasingly unsettling. I started experiencing bizarre nightmares, featuring hallways lined with mirrors, each reflecting a version of myself that moved out of sync. Occasionally, I would spot that aged face from the smoke, standing at the end of the corridor, mouth agape as if attempting to speak. I'd awaken soaked in sweat, heart pounding, the scent of candles lingering in the pillowcase. It felt as though I carried this presence with me wherever I went, even outside. A few times at the office, I caught sight of my reflection in the elevator doors or windows, only to feel queasy when it seemed to shift an instant too late. My colleagues began to notice my edginess. Someone remarked that I looked exhausted and inquired if I was sleeping well. I evaded a direct response, offering vague hints that I was dealing with personal stress. Inside, I was teetering on the brink of panic at all times. My hands occasionally trembled, and I had trouble concentrating on straightforward tasks. Each time a shadow danced at the edge of my vision, I tensed, anticipating something to pounce unexpectedly. My own paranoia was exhausting me, making me question every seemingly normal moment. I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. One evening, I resolved to confront this phenomenon more directly, to face whatever was haunting my reflection. I turned off all the lights in the apartment, except for a single lamp in the living room. The atmosphere was dim and claustrophobic, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I stood in front of the glass door leading to the balcony, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness outside. Slowly, I slid the door open and stepped into the brisk night air. I forced myself to remain there, gazing at the city lights, breathing methodically to steady my nerves. After a few minutes, I sensed a shift in the air, as if a cold breeze had coiled around my ankles. I exhaled, watching the cloud of vapor swirl, half expecting the same ancient face to appear. Instead, a faint glow near the railing caught my attention. It resembled the flicker of a candle flame but disappeared as soon as I concentrated on it. My heart was pounding so fiercely that I felt slightly dizzy. I turned back to the glass door, and there it was again, my reflection, inexplicably out of sync. I slowly raised my arm, and the figure in the glass lagged by a fraction of a second. The eyes in that reflection were narrower, the face taut and almost predatory. It felt as if I were staring at someone who wore my appearance. The appearance felt like an ill-fitting mask. My mouth went dry, and my jaw clenched as a wave of panic surged within my chest. Yet, something held me in place, compelling me to continue watching. The reflection tilted its head at an odd angle, while my own remained upright. A chill crept over my skin, my muscles tensed, and an overwhelming wave of fear enveloped me like a suffocating shroud. The presence seemed to intensify, pressing against my back as if urging me forward. I attempted to breathe, but the air felt oppressively thick. In a desperate moment of bravery, or perhaps sheer terror, I moved closer to the glass, mere inches from this twisted replica of myself. My breath formed tiny clouds on the surface as I steadied my trembling hand and pressed it against the cold glass. The reflection's hand met mine from the opposite side, yet its movement appeared sluggish and distorted. Then, I discerned the faint outline of that old face, superimposed over my own, lips quivering as if trying to whisper something. I could practically taste the bitter tang of fear on my tongue. I have no idea how long I stood there. It might have been mere seconds, but it felt like an eternity. My vision blurred as tears mingled with sweat, and my heart threatened to burst from my chest. Finally, I tore myself away from the balcony, stumbling back inside and slamming the door shut. The reflection vanished behind the curtain. I collapsed onto the couch, breath coming in ragged gasps, limbs trembling uncontrollably. It took several minutes for my pulse to slow enough to think clearly in that moment. In the unsettling haze, I made a sudden resolve. I would not allow this entity, whether a figment of my imagination or something else entirely, to consume me. I refused to shrink back in fear any longer. I rummaged through my closet, seeking an old storage blanket, and draped it over the glass door, effectively erasing my reflection. Then, I gathered every mirror in the apartment. There weren't many, and either covered them with sheets or turned them to face the walls. The effort left me drenched in sweat, and my heart never ceased its frantic pace. However, once I completed the task, the atmosphere felt noticeably calmer, though far from serene. The presence hadn't disappeared, but it appeared somewhat muted, as though struggling to find a surface on which to materialize. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat on my couch, eyes darting to every shadowed corner, ears attuned to every creak and thud. My body remained on high alert, yet I experienced a peculiar sense of defiance. When dawn finally broke through the slits of the blinds, I stood up on shaky knees, a decision firmly in place. I would leave this apartment, at least temporarily. There was no disgrace in seeking a brief sanctuary if it meant safeguarding my sanity. With a heavy heart and a racing pulse, I packed a small bag, covering any reflective surface I encountered. The apartment appeared eerie and incomplete, like a place in hiding. As I opened the door one last time and stepped into the hallway, I sensed the weight of the presence lingering behind me. Just before I closed the door, the faintest trace of that candle scent wafted to my nose, as if offering a final warning. I'm uncertain whether I truly escaped the entity or if it continues to pursue me, but I do know that the moment I left my apartment, I felt a slight relief in my breathing. Even now, there's an unsettling trace of that presence lingering at the back of my mind, a persistent worry that it could reappear in any reflective surface if I let my guard down. Whenever I encounter a window or a mirror, I brace myself for the possibility of seeing a distorted version of my own face or that ancient gaze staring back at me. A part of me suspects that this presence is merely waiting for the opportune moment to catch me unawares. Regardless of where I go, I can't completely shake off the oppressive memory of that warped reflection and the stifling scent of burnt candles. Perhaps I never will. However, I've come to accept that some things elude logic. Occasionally, the darkness side finds a way in, clinging to our deepest fears. Sometimes, the only way to endure is to acknowledge that not every reflection is truly our own and to learn to live fully aware of whatever looks back at us from the other side of the glass. From the very first night I moved into this apartment, I felt a pressure against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. Even before I noticed anything tangible, I sensed an unspoken tension winding around every room's edges. It was present in the silence of the corridors, in the way the overhead lights never seemed quite bright enough, and in the faint hum I could never entirely pinpoint. I attempted to dismiss those sensations, attributing them to the stress of relocating and the echoing silence of the place. In an unfamiliar setting, denial can only sustain itself for so long. When I first heard that inexplicable thud in the living room and discovered several books scattered across the floor, I could no longer ignore the unsettling sensation creeping over me. As a pragmatic man, I prioritize logic over superstition and order over chaos, yet my life in this apartment quickly devolved into anything but orderly. After the initial incident of books tumbling from the shelves, I attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps the shelf was unstable, or maybe I had placed the books too close to the edge. However, the following evening, while I was in the kitchen washing dishes, a distinct scraping noise reached my ears. I turned off the faucet and cautiously crept into the living room, only to witness a small porcelain figurine sliding along the edge of a bookshelf as if propelled by an invisible force. I stood there, immobilized, heart pounding, breath caught in my throat. The figurine lingered for a brief moment before plummeting and shattering on the floor. At that instant, a jolt of dread surged up my spine. I tried to steady myself by clutching the back of a chair, my knuckles turning white. My heart thudded against my ribcage, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept reassuring myself that there had to be a rational explanation, perhaps vibrations from the traffic outside or some peculiar draft. Yet, no windows were open, and the doors remained locked. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Periodically, I thought I heard faint rustling from the living room, as if someone were leafing through the pages of the books I owned. To ice, and I sat frozen, unable to move for a moment. Carefully, I rose from the couch, each step towards the fallen frame feeling like a mile. I picked it up, examining the glass for cracks before setting it back in place with trembling fingers. My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Was it just a draft, or something more sinister? Determined not to let my imagination spiral out of control, I shook off the unease and tried to focus on the TV again. But the knot of anxiety in my stomach tightened, refusing to let go. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of nervous glances and an unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. Eventually, I turned in for the night, hoping sleep would bring some peace. But as I lay in bed, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified, feeding my restless mind. I tried to reassure myself that it was all in my head, that there was nothing to fear in the familiar confines of my own home. Yet, the sense of being watched lingered, as if unseen eyes followed my every move. The next morning, the sun's first rays brought a semblance of calm, though I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As I prepared to leave for work, I glanced around the room, ensuring everything was in its place. The picture frame sat innocently on the TV stand, as if mocking my fear. Despite the daylight and the normalcy of the morning routine, the events of the previous night haunted me, a constant reminder that perhaps not everything was as it seemed. My skin felt clammy, and, for a fleeting moment, my mind went blank. Almost instinctively, I sprang from the couch, my body rigid with tension. The dread was palpable, like a living entity weighing down on me. I inhaled sharply, attempting to steady myself. Then, I heard a soft scraping noise. Turning back, I saw my TV remote gliding across the coffee table on its own, leaving a faint trail in the thin layer of dust I had neglected to clean. I stood there, arms shaking, as it gradually neared the table's edge. It wobbled precariously for an agonizing second before stopping, as if some sinister presence was toying with it. I recall being unable to utter a word, my throat parched. Even if I had wanted to scream, it seemed as though no sound could escape. A wave of nausea churned in my stomach, and my heart thudded so violently, I feared my ribs might break. Then came the worst part. Something brushed against the back of my neck, a chilling draft, like the faintest sigh. I spun around, stumbling as I did, but no one was there. My mind spun, desperately trying to rationalize the sensation. Perhaps there was a draft from a vent, but a glance at the ceiling revealed no vents nearby. It felt almost as if it had been an actual breath, warm enough to stir the hairs on my neck, yet cold in its implications. That was the moment I realized I was not alone in my apartment. For days afterward, I was on edge from dawn until dusk. Objects disappeared without explanation. My glasses, which I was certain I had left on the nightstand, reappeared hours later on top of. I discovered a set of keys near the foot of the sofa, which I was certain I'd left in the bowl by the door. Each occurrence seemed increasingly intentional, as though something was orchestrating a game of hide and seek to capture my attention. My anxiety escalated to the point where every subtle sound, a creak, a tap, or a squeak, sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. My body remained perpetually tense, with a clenched jaw, hunched shoulders, and skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. On several nights, I awoke in a cold sweat, convinced I had heard footsteps crossing the living room floor. When I finally summoned the courage to investigate, I found nothing, only a slightly ajar door or a curtain gently swaying as if recently disturbed. I began questioning my own sanity, fearing I might be succumbing to stress-induced hallucinations. One evening, in desperation, I called a friend's number, seeking a second opinion. He was kind enough to agree to come over and see for himself. Upon his arrival, I tried to explain the incidents, though I felt foolish recounting them. He suggested it might all be in my head but agreed to spend an hour or two in the living room with me. During that time, nothing peculiar occurred. No books fell, no gust of air brushed against our necks, no remote slid across the table. My friend left with an expression of concern for my mental state, though he didn't voice it directly. The moment he departed, the door rattled in its frame behind him, and then I heard a gentle tap from the shelf, as if some presence was letting me know it was still there. The feeling lingered, so I began sleeping with the lights on. I despised the shadows and the illusions they cast upon the walls, as if they hid something ominous just beyond my sight. Even with the lights blazing, the apartment felt gloomier than ever, as though the very walls exuded an oppressive aura. My appetite disappeared, replaced by a queasy tightness in my stomach, and my head throbbed with tension headaches. At work, my colleagues asked if I was all right, noting my pale complexion and the dark circles under my eyes. I lied, claiming I was fighting off a cold. The longer I stayed in that apartment, the more I believed there was an awareness behind these occurrences. It felt intentional, purposeful, like someone silently demanding that I acknowledge their presence. Sometimes, I experienced a peculiar static in the air, an electric charge that made the tiny hairs on my arms stand on end. Other times, I could have sworn I heard faint whispers, though never any words I could clearly decipher, just a subtle, ghostly murmur that would vanish the moment I focused on it. My heart raced every time I caught it, and I found myself trembling without warning, my body locked in a fight or flight response. I tried small rituals to calm myself. I lit scented candles in an effort to make the space feel inviting. I walked from room to room, speaking in a hushed voice, insisting that whoever or whatever shared the apartment with me could rest peacefully. But the tension didn't subside. One night, I felt compelled to open all the drawers and cabinets. As if searching for some hidden explanation for the mysterious occurrences, perhaps an old letter, a concealed compartment, or a clue regarding previous inhabitants. Yet, all I discovered were dusty shelves and the mundane clutter of everyday life. This void left me even more unsettled. On one particularly restless night, I resolved to sit quietly in the living room, determined not to flee from whatever was transpiring. It was well past midnight, and the only illumination came from a table lamp, its bulb flickering intermittently. The silence was profound, broken solely by my own unsteady breaths. My heart thudded with such intensity that I could feel it pulsating in my temples, and my palms were slick with perspiration. For what felt like an eternity, nothing stirred. Then, I heard a barely audible creaking to my left. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, half expecting a figure to emerge from behind the bookshelf. The top row of books, which I had meticulously arranged just days before, began to shift. One by one, they toppled outward, landing heavily on the carpet. The scraping and thudding jarred my nerves as if a shockwave had passed through me. My stomach twisted, and my hands shook uncontrollably. The lamp flickered more intensely, casting shadows that seemed to dance and writhe on the walls. I whispered a plea under my breath, unsure of who or what I was addressing. I begged for this presence to cease, to leave me in peace. I cannot fully convey the sheer terror of grappling with the unknown, with nothing tangible to confront, only an oppressive force that ability to influence the objects surrounding me remained clear, yet my logical mind refused to shut off, which paradoxically made everything more unsettling. I was persistently attempting to find reason in a situation that defied all rationale. When the bulb in the lamp finally expired with a gentle pop, I was enveloped in near darkness. My eyes adjusted just in time to glimpse a shadowy figure darting into the hallway. At least, that's what I believed I saw. I shouted, demanding it show itself, but the only reply was the echo of my own voice reverberating through the silence. By this point, every nerve in my body was tightly wound, and a cold sweat had saturated my shirt. My heart was pounding fiercely in my ears. I groped my way to the light switch, only to find it unresponsive. Panic surged through me as I stumbled toward my bedroom, seizing my flashlight. Standing in the doorway, I directed the unsteady beam down the corridor. The light caught a fleeting movement, a blur skimming along the wall. My mouth went dry, and my fingers felt numb around the flashlight's handle. In that moment, I realized drastic action was necessary. Over the following week, I made arrangements to leave. Sleep had become impossible, and my efforts to rationalize or dismiss the presence had utterly failed. The final night I spent there was the most harrowing. Every sound seemed amplified, as though the walls themselves thrummed with a silent energy. Around 3 a.m., I was roused by a faint dragging noise emanating from the living room. Compelling myself to investigate, I discovered the coffee table had shifted several inches from its usual spot, and atop it lay 3 objects. My eyeglasses, a delicate porcelain figurine that should have been shattered and discarded, and an old photograph I couldn't recall ever displaying. My legs felt as if they might buckle beneath me. The figurine was intact, showing no evidence of its previous break, which defied logic. A wave of dread, as chilling as ice-cold water, swept over me. The photograph depicted my own face, yet with an expression I couldn't remember ever having. I looked utterly terrified in the image, eyes wide, lips slightly parted as if caught mid-scream. Realizing I was dealing with something beyond my understanding, I packed a bag and departed before dawn. My entire body trembled as I drove away. Although my hands were on the steering wheel, my mind remained ensnared in that oppressive apartment. I relocated to a motel across town, convinced that leaving would halt the incidents. For a brief period, I felt a sense of relief. My heartbeat gradually slowed to a more normal rhythm, and I found it easier to breathe. However, the sensation of being watched never completely left me. Even at the motel, I sometimes awoke feeling as though someone hovered at the edge of my bed. Occasionally, I would hear a faint thump reminiscent of books falling to the floor, which caused my mind to spiral, questioning whether I had truly escaped the presence or if it had somehow attached itself to me. I'd stare into the mirror, scrutinizing the reflection for any sign of distortion, half expecting to see that same horrified expression from the photograph. I returned to the apartment during daylight hours to gather more of my belongings, accompanied by a sense of mounting unease. A property manager repeatedly insisted that the building was structurally sound and that the occasional draft was entirely normal. However, regardless of how many times he offered these reassurances, I felt convinced that something inexplicable lingered within those rooms. As I gathered my boxes, I kept a vigilant eye on the shelves, expecting another book to fall or a figurine to slide of its own volition. Strangely, nothing happened in those moments, as if the apartment was mocking me by withholding its manifestations. When I finally handed in my key, I experienced a fleeting sense of closure, yet a deeper apprehension clung to me like a second skin. I sensed that the presence, or perhaps the memory of it, remained, lurking just beyond sight, waiting. Even now, in a different residence, there are moments when I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, hear a faint scraping in an empty room, or feel a soft breath on my neck in the dead of night. My chest tightens at these signs, and a prickly heat sweeps across my skin. I try to convince myself it's merely the echo of what I endured, just the remnants of trauma that refuse to fade away. But in those solitary moments when the lights are low and my mind wanders back to that oppressive apartment, I cannot shake the notion that I never truly left it behind. I carry that unsettling weight with me. The final revelation, or perhaps the ultimate cruelty, is that sometimes there is no neat resolution. There is only the lingering dread that something beyond our understanding can brush against us, altering our reality. We live in ways that often defy precise expression, where sometimes escaping merely involves placing physical distance between oneself and the unknown, even if the mind remains ensnared in that place of dread. Regardless of how far I journey or how many years slip by, the memory of that breath on my neck, the remote mysteriously skittering across the table, and the inexplicable reassembly of shattered porcelain will forever be imprinted on my consciousness. In the still moments when the world slumbers and shadows creep into the room's corners, I still brace myself for the slightest movement of an object, the subtle indication that I am, once more, not alone. The afternoon sun's heat pressed heavily on my shoulders as I coasted to a halt, my tires crunching over the gravel at the forest trail's edge. That searing warmth, which should have been comforting after a satisfying ride, felt oppressive, like a spotlight trained directly on me, revealing my every action to unseen eyes in the trees. My breath caught in my throat, an unfamiliar constriction gripping my chest, as if the forest itself was releasing a deep, prolonged sigh. I am a man in my 30s who has always turned to cycling as an escape. With each turn of the pedals, I typically discover a sense of serenity, a rhythm that drowns out the chaos of daily life. This particular stretch of trail had become my preferred refuge, cutting through a rolling landscape of dense pines and ancient oaks that creak and sway even on windless days. The forest floor is often blanketed with needles and scattered leaves, muffling the sound of passing animals. Normally, the forest is a tranquil haven, a sanctuary of cool shadows and gently filtered sunlight. However, that day, the hush felt wrong, as if it were a silence imposed rather than a natural stillness. I dismounted to catch my breath, leaning my bike against a crooked tree trunk. My legs buzzed with the pleasant fatigue that follows a long ride, yet my mind refused to find peace. My ears caught a faint sound, perhaps on the very edge of hearing, a soft humming. I froze, trying to discern whether it was the wind or something else. The sound was low and rhythmic, almost like a chant, emanating from within the trees, deeper in the gloom where the sun's rays couldn't penetrate. I remember a chill creeping down my spine, despite the broad daylight and the birds chirping overhead. I had no reason to be afraid, yet my heart pounded harder than during the steepest part of the trail. Initially, I attempted to dismiss it. The forest often plays tricks, and I've been startled before by rustling animals or the distant hoot of an owl. But there was something about that droning hum that tugged at me. It was as if multiple voices were layered atop one another, blending into a single unsettling note. Not quite melodic, not entirely chaotic. Just a whispering choir that made my skin prickle. My hands felt clammy on the straps of my backpack, and I realized my breaths were becoming shallow. I decided, perhaps foolishly, that I needed to discover what it was. I placed my helmet on my handlebars and ventured into the shadows, each footstep accompanied by the crunch of twigs and the rustle of dried leaves with every few steps. As I moved forward, the chanting became more distinct, though it never rose above a muted whisper. It resonated through the air, making my stomach churn with anxiety. The further I ventured, the darker it grew, as if the sunlight was being drained away. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the dryness in my mouth compelled me to swallow repeatedly to prevent my throat from closing. Suddenly, a flash of purple light blinded me, slicing through the gloom like a knife and casting elongated shadows on the moss-covered ground. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the dancing spots from my vision. Just as quickly as it appeared, the light vanished, and the chanting ceased, leaving a suffocating silence, somehow more oppressive than before. My limbs trembled with tension, and my skin felt cold despite the sweat trickling down my back. I surveyed the area, the hairs on my neck standing on end with the unshakable sensation that someone, or something, was behind me. I turned slowly, my nerves ablaze. There was no one there, only a thick tree trunk covered in patches of lichen, gnarled roots, and the hush of the forest. Yet, that presence lingered, vast and undeniable, pressing on my senses like a weight on my chest. Every fiber of my being screamed that a towering figure hovered just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, observing me. A wave of dizziness swept over me, and my legs threatened to give way. I grasped a nearby branch to steady myself. My breathing becoming ragged. I took a slow, deliberate breath to try to calm the panic surging within. At that moment, I felt certain. If I dared to turn once more, I feared I would encounter something far too enormous, too grotesque, too unfathomable to grasp. Yet, an insistent curiosity, perhaps tinged with a streak of stubbornness, compelled me to pivot my head. All that met my gaze were the familiar jagged outlines of tree trunks and the dense maze of intertwined branches. No shapes seemed out of place, no silhouettes hinted at a concealed presence, nothing except an unusual scent that wafted past my nose, vaguely metallic, reminiscent of aged coins or the tang of iron-laced air. My stomach twisted, and I gagged briefly before regaining my composure. Instinct urged me to flee. The chanting had ceased, replaced by a silence so profound that my own heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears. I staggered, half running, back to where I had left my bicycle, expecting to find it standing there untouched, just as I had left it. Instead, I encountered something that sent a surge of raw fear coursing through me. Wet handprints on the handlebars, with large, elongated fingers trailing across the metal, dripping a clear, viscous substance onto the ground. My breath hitched in my throat, a startled half-choke that seared my lungs. I glanced around, hoping to catch sight of whoever, or whatever, had done this. But there was nothing, save for a faint rustling sound, as if something were slithering through the underbrush. That sound wrapped around me like a living entity, raising every hair on my body. My heart thudded against my rib cage so violently that I feared it might bruise. I forced myself to grasp the bike, ignoring the damp and peculiarly sticky sensation of the handlebars. I wiped my palms on my shorts, but the feeling of dampness stuck to my fingers as if it were ingrained in my skin. Hastily, I tried to put my helmet back on, though my hands shook so violently that I nearly dropped it. My whole body buzzed with a restless fear, a tension that made it nearly impossible to think clearly. For a moment, I couldn't recall which direction would lead me back to the main trail. The forest can feel like an intricate maze when you're anxious and breathing too fast to concentrate. At last, I spotted the faint line of gravel through a gap in the trees and pedaled away, my legs burning with the exertion of rapid acceleration. The rustling that trailed me was maddening. It never grew louder, never vanished completely, always stayed just at the edge of my perception, like a presence lurking behind each tree. Sometimes it sounded like leaves brushing against bark, other times like a muted footstep on soft ground. Sweat poured down my temples, cold and salty, stinging my eyes. Every muscle in my torso was tense, my lungs struggling to draw in enough air to keep me steady. I felt hyper-aware of every root and rock beneath my tires, as though a single misstep might bring me face to face with whatever hid in that forest. I didn't stop until I burst through the last patch of trees and onto the open road that led back into town. My entire body was trembling from an adrenaline surge. I leaned forward on the handlebars, chest heaving, trying to calm the frantic pounding in my ears. When I glanced down at the metal tee, the damp handprints had vanished, either evaporated or perhaps absorbed by the material, leaving not even a trace behind. A shiver coursed through me as I recalled the unmistakable outline of those fingers, the droplet like water trickling onto the ground. It left me wondering if I had imagined the entire incident, yet my memory insisted it had been real. I could have simply gone straight home, locked my doors, and buried myself beneath the covers. Instead, I headed to the nearest convenience store to purchase some water and force my frayed nerves to calm down. I remember the cashier asking if I was alright, more out of polite routine than genuine concern, and I merely mumbled that I had experienced a rough trail ride. I avoided making direct eye contact, feeling my heart race once more as I replayed the events in my mind. I'm certain my face was pale and drenched in sweat because the cashier's expression shifted from indifferent to uneasy. He quietly suggested I take a moment to rest, so I stood beside a rack of energy bars, trying to regulate my breathing. My reflection in the store's window appeared haunted, with eyes opened just a fraction too wide and lips pressed into a thin line. That night, I slept fitfully. Shadows in my bedroom seemed to possess a life of their own, swaying in rhythm with the memory of that eerie chanting. Each time I managed to drift off, I dreamt of a colossal silhouette lurking at the edge of my vision, a heavy form composed of tangled branches and purple lightning. I would jolt awake, a sheen of sweat clinging to my skin, my heart pounding in my chest, no matter how often I tried to. I turned on the lamp to reassure myself that I was truly alone. The sensation of being observed lingered with me persistently for days. I avoided the forest, where I usually enjoyed my morning rides. They now felt wrong, like an invitation to face something I wasn't prepared to confront. I attempted to take alternate routes along quieter streets, but I couldn't shake off the persistent feeling of being followed. As I pedaled through deserted roads, a faint static seemed to gnaw at the back of my mind, constantly reminding me of that day. The purple flash, those damp handprints. My sleep was continually disturbed, and I began noticing movements in my peripheral vision. I'd quickly turn my head, only to find empty corners. Doors in my apartment appeared slightly ajar, even when I was certain I had closed them. A faint, nearly imperceptible scent of iron lingered in the air at night. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that perhaps I was experiencing some kind of stress-induced paranoia. I mentioned to a friend, somewhat indirectly, that I had a strange encounter in the woods, without going into details, just that something had unsettled me. They suggested it might have been a vagrant or an animal, and that my mind could have filled in the gaps. I clung to that explanation for the sake of my sanity, but deep down, I knew it was something else, something beyond explanation. About a week later, I resolved to confront my fear. I was exhausted from living with the feeling that every passing shadow heralded another nightmare. If I returned, perhaps I'd prove to myself that it was all some bizarre hallucination brought on by fatigue and a hyperactive imagination. That's what I assured myself, yet deep inside, dread coiled in my stomach like a snake ready to strike. The late afternoon sun stretched shadows across the path. Upon reaching the forest entrance once more, my hands trembled on the handlebars, and each pedal stroke seemed unnaturally loud. Overhead, birds chirped, their song unsettlingly off-key. The air felt dense, almost too heavy to breathe. I pressed on, convincing myself that if anything was truly there, I would notice it with clear vision this time. The further I ventured, the more my skin tingled, and my head throbbed with every push on the pedals. A metallic taste lingered on my tongue. The shadows beneath the trees appeared alive, shifting in unnatural patterns. I began to notice a flicker of purple in the corner of my eye, but whenever I looked directly, it disappeared. My breath rasped between my teeth, my arms grew clammy, and the tension in my neck made it difficult to turn my head without grimacing. As I rounded a bend, the forest canopy thickened, and the temperature seemed to drop sharply. My teeth chattered briefly, more from nerves than cold, but the chill was unmistakable. That's when I heard it, the chanting, low and rhythmic, just like before. It started as a faint hum, gradually building, enveloping me in layers of dissonant whispers. My heart pounded so fiercely I feared I might faint. I dismounted and let the bike rest on the trail. The chanting was beckoning me deeper again, or perhaps it was merely echoing from all directions, my mind told me. I wanted to turn around and flee, but my legs propelled me forward on their own. Each step was accompanied by the snapping of twigs, the crunching of leaves, and an internal chorus of panic pleading with me to stop. My stomach tightened, and my breathing became shallow and rapid. Then I saw it, a shimmering streak of purple light in the air, much like before, but this time it lingered. It resembled a tear in reality, jagged around the edges and pulsating with an unearthly glow. The chanting grew louder, the forest darkened, and my entire body vibrated with tension, sweat pouring down my brow. I wanted to scream, but my voice failed me. As I edged closer, the chanting abruptly stopped, the rip in the air flickered, and I sensed that immense presence behind me once more. My scalp tingled, my arms were locked at my sides, and fear pounded in my chest. Yet, I forced myself to turn around. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw something, an impossible shape shrouded in shadows, towering over any tree, its head tilted as if observing me from above. A wave of nausea twisted my gut, my vision blurred, the shape flickered, and then it vanished. The rustling returned, echoing around me, and I sprinted back toward my bike. I expected to find it covered in those damp handprints once more, but it was untouched. Only the seat was slightly askew, as if someone had attempted to sit on it. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I realized my entire body was shaking so violently that I could barely steady the bike. I launched myself onto the seat and pedaled as fast as I could, the trees flashing by in streaks. A single entity, shades of green and brown filled my vision, accompanied by a persistent rustling that refused to fade away or draw nearer. It served as a constant reminder that I wasn't truly alone. My lungs were ablaze as I burst out of the forest and onto the open road, resisting the urge to glance back. When I finally slowed down, a dull pain spread across my chest, and my hands felt numb, as if the handlebars were forged from ice. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was near me remained close, perhaps lurking just beyond the edge of reality. The chanting reverberated in my mind long after I had left the trees behind. Even in the bright sunlight, I felt enveloped by a darkness that clung to my thoughts, prying open every hidden fear. In the days that followed, no clear answers emerged regarding what had transpired in that forest, yet the memory pursued me relentlessly. Occasionally, from the corner of my eye, I would catch a fleeting glimpse of purple. Late at night, that rustling noise seemed to emanate from beneath my window, coaxing my pulse into a feverish rhythm. My dreams remained haunted by the enormous silhouette looming behind me, beckoning me to turn around and confront something I couldn't possibly comprehend without losing my grip on sanity. I haven't returned to that trail since, and part of me wonders if the forest allowed me to leave or if it's merely a matter of time before it summons me again. Each day, I awaken with the memory of that chanting echoing in my mind, the tactile memory of damp handprints clinging to my skin, and the impression of a presence so vast it couldn't belong to a single being. Rationality urges me to move forward, to consign it to the domain of nightmares. Yet, deep within, I feel that the barrier separating that place from my own has grown thin, leaving me uncertain of my freedom. Even as I describe this, my heart races, and sweat gathers along my hairline. My hands quiver slightly over the keyboard, and I catch the metallic scent of iron in the air, though its source eludes me. A wave of paranoia constricts my chest, as if the forest itself is reminding me of its presence, waiting with that glimmering purple rift in reality. Next time, I might not possess the determination or fortune to escape. Thus, I live each day hoping that the rustling in the shadows remains merely a sound without form. Yet on certain nights, I am convinced I feel that immense presence just inches behind me, its breath heavy and alien against my neck, poised to reclaim what it once touched. I choose not to turn around because, truthfully, a part of me is aware of exactly what I would see. The moment I crossed the threshold of this house, a sensation coiled in the pit of my stomach, as if the shadows in the hallway extended slightly too far to welcome me. The air carried a musty odor, a faint hint of damp wood, and an intangible presence pressed against my skin. I reassured myself it was my imagination. An older house could have its peculiarities. However, there was a distinctive weight to the atmosphere, a feeling that every inch of the house held its breath, much like I was attempting to do. My heart thudded with awe. Each hesitant step I took that night made me feel more like an intruder than a tenant. Before I even began to unpack my suitcases, an unsettling feeling gnawed at me, suggesting something was amiss. I had relocated here shortly after a significant life change, one that I preferred not to dwell on. The landlord had advertised the place as a furnished rental, complete with well-worn armchairs and antique shelves. Initially, I found these details charming. I've always been drawn to items with a history, so the chipped paint on the walls and the creaking wooden floorboards didn't deter me. In fact, during the landlord's tour, my attention was captured by three peculiar objects. An old locket that resembled a museum relic, a small bronze statue perched on the highest shelf, and a tiny pocket mirror lying innocuously on a side table. My curiosity was piqued, but I refrained from asking about them as the landlord shot me an uneasy glance whenever my gaze lingered on these items. He merely mentioned that the previous tenant had been a collector of curiosities and advised me to handle the pieces with care. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. The first week passed in relative tranquility, though it was punctuated by odd impressions. I'd head to the kitchen for breakfast, convinced I heard faint shuffling behind me, yet a glance over my shoulder would reveal only the dusty corridor. At night, I sometimes felt a gentle tug on my blanket, as if someone had passed by the bed. I dismissed these occurrences, attributing them to my nerves adjusting to a new environment, even though my hands trembled so much that I struggled to hold my belongings securely. Evening tea was a ritual I could barely manage without spilling. My breathing grew shallow each time I heard an unexplainable rustle or creak. Repeatedly, I reassured myself that old houses naturally made noises and that I shouldn't let my imagination run wild. Yet, each time I whispered this to myself, a muted sense of dread tightened its hold on my chest, quickening my pulse until pretending it was normal became impossible. I began to notice something peculiar about three particular objects. The reliquary, for instance, always seemed to be angled differently whenever I passed it on the mantel. Some days, its hinge was ajar, revealing just a sliver of its contents. A photograph so aged that it had yellowed and become brittle around the edges. One morning, I discovered the reliquary fully open, the picture inside facing outward, as if silently demanding my attention. It depicted a man whose face I couldn't quite recognize, yet his cold, dark eyes seemed to burn into me, despite never having encountered him before. The moment I glanced at it, my mouth dried up, and a prickling sensation crept down my spine. It felt as though he was observing me from across time, judging me for intruding upon what might have been his home. I carefully closed the locket, my fingers trembling so violently that I nearly dropped it, then retreated with a sense of shame, as if I had violated someone else's private memory. Next, there was the small pocket mirror. It rested on a side table in the living room, alongside some dusty magazines left behind by the previous tenant. I never touched it each time. I glanced toward it, and a disconcerting reflection of my own eyes stared back at me. The glass was slightly warped, creating a peculiar distortion that made my face appear hollowed out, as if something were draining the life from me. Over several evenings, I could have sworn that the mirror was no longer on the table but had been relocated to the coffee stand or perched on a windowsill. Each time, I convinced myself that I must have moved it or absent-mindedly placed it somewhere else. Yet the unsettling truth was that I had no memory of handling it at all. My heart pounded so fiercely whenever I noticed its new resting place that I felt my temples throb and a bead of sweat trickle down my back. I tried to rationalize the situation, thinking perhaps I needed more sleep or that stress was taking its toll. However, deep down, I understood that something unnatural was occurring. The bronze statue was perhaps the most disquieting of the three objects. It depicted a robed figure with its face partially eroded by time, leaving only hollow contours where its features should have been. Its position on the highest shelf seemed stable enough that even if the house shifted in strong winds, it shouldn't move. However, I occasionally noticed it was angled differently, turned as if it were trying to watch me in the same wary way I kept an eye on it. On one particularly calm evening, I walked into the living room and found the statue at the edge of the shelf, as if it had slid forward on its own. My immediate reaction was to step back, my pulse hammering in my neck. I tried nudging the shelf, expecting a wobble that might explain its movement, yet the piece of furniture scarcely shifted. The statue, however, was precariously balanced, threatening to topple with the slightest nudge. I gingerly nudged it back to its original position, my hands slick with sweat against the cold bronze. The sensation of the metal against my palm was unsettling. It felt warmer than it should have, as if it had absorbed body heat. Despite these peculiar occurrences, life continued. I endeavored to focus on my work at the desk in the adjacent room, typing with fervor to drown out the burgeoning anxiety within me. My sleep was restless, filled with tossing and turning, always acutely aware of an unshakable presence just beyond my bedroom door. Occasionally, I would hear deliberate, slow footsteps in the hallway, followed by an almost charged silence. My throat would constrict, and a thin sheen of sweat would break out as my heart raced. I kept reassuring myself that it was merely the house settling. My rational mind struggled against the creeping paranoia that I was living among silent, watchful entities. Whenever I attempted to rest, those creeping sensations of being watched would intensify, culminating in a racing pulse that rendered sleep nearly impossible. Matters escalated one evening while I was reading in the living room. The reliquary, which I had securely closed that morning, stood open once more on the mantel. The photograph inside seemed to fix me with an almost accusatory stare. I felt an unexpected surge of anger, as if I were being taunted, so I seized the reliquary in my hand and snapped it shut. Slammed shut with more force than was necessary. The door echoed in the room, and almost immediately, a chilling gust swept through, causing the curtains to flutter. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, as if an invisible force had wrapped itself around me. In that moment, it felt intensely personal, as though I had somehow insulted someone or something that demanded my respect. My hands started to shake uncontrollably, and I had to put the relic down before I accidentally dropped it. My breathing came in shallow pants, my heart thundering within my chest, while a cold sweat formed on my forehead. For the first time, I understood that I had crossed far beyond the realm of ordinary explanations. As I struggled to drift off to sleep that same night, I felt the weight of eyes upon me once more, as though the house's occupant, whether alive or not, stood just outside my bedroom door. I heard the maddening shuffle of light footsteps traversing the hallway floorboards. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I lay rigid as a board beneath the covers, perspiration breaking out across my skin. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I slipped into a restless slumber. In the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by an unusual thud. My heart raced erratically, and my mouth instantly went dry. Leaving the warmth of my bed, I ventured into the corridor. It took all my resolve to move forward, my feet feeling as heavy as lead. The living room was softly illuminated by a faint glow from a streetlight outside the window, and I immediately noticed the bronze statue on the floor. It had toppled from the shelf, landing on the rug. At that very moment, I heard a muffled scream. As I moved cautiously through the house, I froze, my blood roaring in my ears. Panic clouded my vision, yet my senses became acutely aware. The darkness in the corners seemed to cling to the walls, and I felt an overwhelming sensation of being surrounded by invisible onlookers. My chest tightened as I listened intently. The scream hadn't originated from outside but rather from somewhere within these very walls. Summoning courage I didn't know I possessed, I flicked on the living room light, only to find that the pocket mirror was missing from its usual place on the side table. My pulse was pounding so fiercely that it made me feel lightheaded. I heard another faint noise, like quick footsteps shuffling on the hallway floor. I followed the sound, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I reached the next room. The door stood ajar, and the only illumination came from the glow of a distant street lamp filtering through the window. Inside, resting on a dusty old armchair, lay the pocket mirror, its reflective surface facing the corridor as if beckoning me to retrieve it. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The oppressive silence in the room made my own heartbeat thunder in my ears. My fingers trembled as I reached for the mirror, expecting to see the reflection of my terrified face. However, in the distorted glass, I glimpsed a fleeting image that didn't belong to me. It resembled the same man from the reliquary, his face twisted by something akin to rage or desperation. My entire body jolted with cold shock, and I nearly dropped the mirror. Then the image vanished, leaving only my terrified reflection staring back at me. The expression lingering behind those moments marked the beginning of my unraveling sense of reality. My already restless sleep deteriorated into a collection of fragmented bouts, interrupted by hushed noises and shifting shadows. I constantly felt as though unseen eyes were fixated on me, particularly around the old, antique items. My efforts to reach out to the landlord resulted in perplexing interactions. He only emphasized the house's notorious reputation but never provided further details. He insinuated that the previous occupant was deeply attached to these objects and suggested they might be imbued with some form of energy. While he didn't articulate it precisely that way, the implication was unmistakable. My stomach churned each time I revisited that conversation, feeling as if I had been entrapped in an unwanted inheritance. Over time, I became increasingly convinced that the house itself was orchestrating the presence of the relics, the mirror and the statue, or that some entity was channeling through them. I reached a point where I could hardly recognize my reflection in the bathroom mirror each morning. I appeared hollow and tense, as if I had aged several years in just a few weeks. Occasionally, a faint tapping would begin around 3 a.m., causing my heart to pound violently as beads of sweat formed on my upper lip. Despite my attempts, I could never locate the origin of these taps, and they always ceased the instant I summoned the courage to investigate. At one point, I found myself pacing back and forth along the hallway multiple times each night, checking every corner for intruders I logically knew didn't exist. Yet, the intangible sensation of being observed never dissipated. As each day passed, the tightness in my chest intensified. One evening, overwhelmed by the relentless anxiety, I resolved that I must either confront whatever haunted this place or leave it behind forever. My body trembled, my thoughts were unraveling, and I took the reliquary from the mantelpiece, the photograph still carefully tucked inside. I carried it to the middle of the living room, my hands damp with sweat, my breaths coming in erratic bursts. My intention was to speak aloud, to demand an end to whatever game was unfolding, but my throat felt constricted, and I could only manage a broken whisper. I proclaimed that I wished to have no involvement in this history, that I respected whatever or whoever lingered here, but I yearned for peace. My voice faltered on the final words, and a sudden rush of cold air swept through the room. Once more, a sense of weight pressed upon me, as if something was deciding whether to attack or relent. The lights flickered, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed a figure standing behind me in the reflection of the pocket mirror on the shelf. My heart pounded as if it might explode, and my legs nearly gave way beneath me. When the light steadied, there was nothing there. Somehow, I found the strength to gather all three objects into a box and stow them away in a cramped closet at the far end of the hallway. Logic told me this might not help, but a desperate part of me hoped that removing them from my sight would restore a shred of sanity. That night, I felt lighter, though I still shivered with lingering fear. The footsteps receded, the knocking ceased, and I dared to allow myself some sleep. Dreams were a chaotic medley of an antiquated house, an unfamiliar man's visage, and a reflection that never aligned with my own. As I awoke to the gentle hue of dawn, I noticed the air had changed. It felt less oppressive, as if the house itself had released a tired sigh. Cautiously, I tiptoed to the closet, half expecting the door to be ajar or the box to lie empty, but it was sealed precisely as I had left it, and, for once, the house was silent. I wish I could claim that I felt entirely secure from that point forward, but that wouldn't be honest. There remains a persistent tension lurking in the corridors, an echo of that muffled scream from the dead of night. Occasionally, I find myself glancing at the closet door, my heart racing with the memory of the terror I once faced. Even now, the recollection of that warped face in the mirror haunts me, and I must constantly remind myself that I am awake and firmly anchored in reality. I haven't moved out yet, though the urge is intensifying. Perhaps I've become obstinate or too inquisitive for my own well-being, wondering if this place might eventually reveal answers unattainable elsewhere. Or maybe some part of me hopes that by enduring these shivers and sleepless nights, I'll finally unravel the enigma of who that man in the photograph is and why his spirit, or whatever fragment of him lingers, clings to these halls. Regardless of what happens next, this house has left its mark on me. My hands still quiver when I recall the statue rolling off the shelf, and my throat constricts when I remember the unsettling reflections in the pocket mirror. And my stomach twists uneasily whenever my thoughts wander to the relic with its haunting photograph. The nights continue to feel oppressive and vigilant, but at least now I understand I can withstand it. Whether I decide to depart tomorrow or linger a bit longer, I've realized that certain doors in life reveal mysteries better left unexplored. At times, the sole true option is to confront the darkness, breath unsteady and heart racing, refusing to be devoured by it. For even when faced with the unknown, the drive to survive can outpace fear, if only by a few erratic beats.